Before exploring the dramatic events of Ivan the Terrible's reign, it is essential to understand the powerful noble families who shaped Russian politics behind the scenes. Their rivalries, alliances, and ambitions influenced nearly every major decision made in Moscow. At the center of this political world stood the Boyar Duma, the Council of the Realm. Although it served as the Tsar's highest advisory and legislative body, its authority always depended on the ruler's favor. Any recommendation could be ignored or overturned at a moment's notice, especially under Tsar Ivan IV, whose rule became increasingly absolute. During his reign, the council was dominated by a handful of influential dynasties, including the Shuiskys, Mstislavskys, Belskys, and Romanovs, along with many noble families tied to them through marriage or political loyalty. Most of these aristocratic houses trace their ancestry to Yuri Dolgoruki, the son of Vladimir Monomakh. In the mid-12th century, Yuri established his power in the northeastern lands of Rus, laying the foundations for a new political center far from Kiev. Over time, his descendants split into several branches, but one line rose above all others. Through Alexander Nevsky and later his grandson Ivan Kalita, the princes of Moscow gradually claimed superiority over the rest of the Rurik dynasty. This growing prestige transformed Moscow into the leading center of Russian power and allowed its rulers to present themselves as the rightful heirs of all the old princely traditions. Not every descendant of Yuri Dolgoruki enjoyed the same status. The princes of Vladimir Suzdal descended from Alexander Nevsky's brother Andrei, and while they remained immensely wealthy, the expansion of Moscow steadily weakened their political independence. By the reign of Ivan Kalita, these princes were increasingly treated as subjects of Moscow rather than equals. They retained enormous estates and thousands of serfs, but their influence at court declined. The Moscow rulers further diluted the exclusivity of princely titles by granting them to noble immigrants from Lithuania, the Caucasus, and even to families whose ancestors had mixed with the Mongol elite during the centuries of Tatar domination. Among the old Vladimir Suzdal dynasties, none carried greater prestige in the 16th century than the Shuisky family. Their ancestor was Prince Andrei Yaroslavich, and generations later they remained one of the most respected noble houses in Russia. Prince Peter Shuisky earned distinction as an outstanding military commander, while his son, Ivan, became celebrated for defending Pskov against a prolonged siege during the Livonian War. Another member of the family, Ivan Andreevich Shuisky, also won fame in campaigns against Sweden despite failing to capture the fortress of Oreshek. His sons, including Vasily, Andrei, Dmitry, Alexander, and Ivan, would all emerge as important political figures. Vasily Shuisky, who began his military career fighting the Crimean Tatars, would eventually use his ancient ancestry to justify claiming the Russian throne during the turbulent years known as the Time of Troubles. Another branch of the family produced Mikhail Skopin Shuisky, one of the era's greatest military heroes. The Mstislavsky family possessed an equally impressive pedigree, also tracing its bloodline to Andrei Yaroslavich. Its leading representative, Prince Ivan Mstislavsky, strengthened his position through his grandmother Evdokia, a daughter of Ivan III. This royal connection made him one of the closest noble relatives of the ruling dynasty. Throughout Ivan IV's reign, he became the senior member of the Boyar Duma, commanded Russian armies, and earned a reputation as one of the most respected statesmen in the country. Even after his imprisonment, the family's influence continued through his son Fyodor Mstislavsky, who played a decisive role in navigating Russia through civil conflict, foreign invasions, and political collapse. Closely connected to the Mstislavskys were the Golitsins, another distinguished princely house. Vasily Golitsyn later emerged as one of the contenders for the Russian throne following the fall of the first false Dmitry, while his brother Ivan gained recognition as a capable military commander. Like several other noble families, both the Golitsins and the Mstislavskys had spent generations in Lithuania during the Mongol period before eventually returning to serve the rulers of Moscow. Another towering figure of the age was Nikita Romanov Yuriev-Zakharin, the man whose descendants would establish the Romanov dynasty that ruled Russia for more than 3 centuries. His family was already closely connected to the throne. His sister Anastasia became the beloved first wife of Ivan IV and the mother of Tsar Fyodor I. Unlike many nobles who fell victim to Ivan's violent purges, Nikita managed to avoid both disgrace and execution. He earned widespread admiration for his moderation, generosity, and steady character during one of the bloodiest periods in Russian history. After his death in 1586, his children continued expanding the family's influence through political service and strategic marriages with other aristocratic houses. The Belsky name actually referred to two separate noble branches. One originated in Lithuania and included powerful figures such as Maluta Skuratov-Belsky, one of Ivan the Terrible's most feared enforcers, along with his relatives Bogdan and Semyon. The other branch descended from the princes of Vladimir and had earlier attempted to dominate Russian politics after the death of Vasily III, the father of Ivan IV. Among the more unusual personalities of the period was Semyon Bekbulatovich. Born as the Mongol prince Sain-Bulat, he entered Russian service after his people were defeated during Ivan's conquest of Kazan. Following his conversion to Orthodox Christianity, he received a Russian name, princely rank, and control over Tver and Torjok. In one of the most extraordinary episodes of Russian history, Ivan IV even briefly proclaimed him Tsar of Moscow, making him a constant source of political uncertainty for anyone who later occupied the throne. In the political world of 16th century Russia, marriage was rarely a private affair. Among the great aristocratic houses, it was one of the most effective instruments of power. A wedding could turn former rivals into allies, bind military commanders to court officials, or create obligations that lasted for generations. These family connections often determined where loyalties would fall when the state entered a period of crisis. The daughters of Maluta Skuratov-Belsky illustrate this system clearly. Maria married Boris Godunov, while Ekaterina became the wife of Dmitry Shuisky. Through these marriages, Skuratov connected his household to two families that would later compete for influence at the highest level of government. The Cherkassky brothers were drawn into a similar network. Vasily Mikhailovich married one of Fyodor Mstislavsky's sisters, while his brother Boris Mikhailovich married a sister of Fyodor Nikitich Romanov. Another Romanov sister became the wife of Ivan Ivanovich Godunov, a cousin of Boris Godunov. The Mstislavsky family also strengthened its political reach when another of its daughters married Semyon Bekbulatovich, the former Tatar ruler who had briefly carried the title of Tsar of Moscow. The Shuiskys, Vorotinskys, and Golitsins were connected in the same way. Vasily Shuisky and Ivan Vorotinsky married sisters, both daughters of Prince Peter Ivanovich Buinosov of Rostov. These women were also related to the wife of Vasily Golitsyn. As a result, nearly every major political faction was linked to another through blood or marriage. Such relationships did not guarantee permanent friendship. Families could still quarrel, betray one another, or compete for the throne, yet kinship shaped the choices available to them. When danger approached, noblemen often supported those whose survival protected their own relatives, estates, and ambitions. Russian aristocratic politics therefore resembled a tightly woven web in which the rise or fall of one household could affect many others. Among the families that rose through this world of marriage, service, and political calculation, none experienced a more remarkable ascent than the Godunovs. According to family tradition, the Godunov line began with Chet Murza, a prince from the Golden Horde who came to Moscow from Sarai during the reign of Grand Prince Ivan Kalita in the 14th century. Sarai was then one of the principal cities of the Mongol world, situated near the lower Volga River. Chet Murza eventually settled in the region of Kostroma, married a Russian woman, and entered the Orthodox Christian faith. The traditional story claims that Metropolitan Peter baptized him and gave him the Christian name Zachariah. Several generations later, one of his descendants became known as Ivan Godun. From this personal name emerged the family name Godunov. Although later enemies sometimes emphasized the clan's Tatar origins, the Godunovs had lived in Russia for generations. They were not foreign slaves or recent arrivals at court. They served Russian princes and noblemen, acquired property, and gradually established themselves as landowners. Some branches became wealthy in the Vyazma region, while others earned distinction through military service. Chet Murza was also remembered as a benefactor of the Ipatiev monastery in Kostroma, where tradition held that he was eventually buried. The monastery would remain closely associated with the Godunov family and, much later, with the rise of the Romanovs. Boris Fyodorovich Godunov was born in 1552. His father, Fyodor Ivanovich, possessed land but did not belong to the richest level of the Russian aristocracy. Boris had a brother named Dmitry and a younger sister named Irina. Their family estates in the Kostroma region provided a degree of security, especially after their father's death. The three children were then taken into the household of their uncle, Dmitry Ivanovich Godunov. Almost nothing is known about their mother, but their uncle appears to have assumed responsibility for their upbringing and future careers. He became the most important figure in their early lives. The Godunovs' relatively modest status may initially have protected them. Ivan the Terrible's oprichnina was directed largely against powerful landowning families whose property and influence appeared threatening to the crown. Because the Godunovs did not yet possess enormous estates or an independent political following, they escaped the first wave of destruction that engulfed many older aristocratic houses. Dmitry Godunov nevertheless entered the oprichnina. His time within the institution revealed that he possessed genuine administrative ability. Ivan IV was searching for younger officials whose advancement depended entirely on royal favor rather than ancient ancestry. Dmitry fitted this requirement perfectly. He soon moved beyond ordinary oprichnina service and obtained a position within the palace administration. This appointment transformed the fortunes of the entire family. Through his access to the Kremlin court, Dmitry introduced Boris and Irina into the social and political world of the ruling dynasty. Boris was still a teenager when his uncle entered palace service. Irina was only about 7 years old. She was almost the same age as Tsarevich Fyodor Ivanovich, Ivan IV's second surviving son, who had been born in 1557. Growing up near the royal household gave both children opportunities that their father could never have provided. They received an education suited to palace life and became familiar with the ceremonies, customs, and personal relationships of the court. Their future no longer depended solely on provincial estates. It became tied to the Tsar and his family. Dmitry Godunov's position improved further after the death of Vasily Naumov, Ivan IV's chamberlain. Dmitry was selected to replace him, giving him direct access to the ruler. The office was far more than ceremonial. The chamberlain operated close to the Tsar's person and could influence appointments, audiences, and private decisions. At the same time, the oprichnina was becoming an instrument of terror. One of its most notorious leaders was Grigory Skuratov-Belsky, better known by his nickname Maluta. Through brutality and unquestioning obedience, he gained the confidence of Ivan the Terrible and became one of the ruler's most feared agents. Maluta's reputation was built upon acts of extreme violence. In 1569, he was associated with the killing of Metropolitan Philip, the senior churchman who had openly condemned the oprichnina. According to the traditional account, Maluta personally strangled him in his monastic cell. He was also deeply involved in the destruction of Novgorod in 1570. Ivan believed that the city's leading inhabitants were preparing to betray him and defect to Lithuania. The resulting campaign became one of the darkest episodes of his reign. Residents were tortured, executed, or drowned, while homes, churches, and warehouses were plundered. Contemporary and later accounts offered enormous figures for the number of victims, though the precise scale remains uncertain. What is beyond doubt is that Novgorod suffered mass executions, confiscations, and widespread devastation under the direction of the Tsar and his oprichniki. Maluta's ambition was not directed only against suspected enemies. He also turned upon former associates when their removal could strengthen his own position. Alexei Basmanov, once an influential advisor and senior nobleman, fell from favor. Other officials, including Afanasy Vyazemsky and Peter Zaitsev, were also destroyed during the internal struggles of the oprichnina. The Godunovs survived because they were still too minor to appear dangerous. Instead of targeting them, Maluta recognized that Dmitry Godunov could be useful. By 1571 and 1572, the two men had developed a practical political partnership. Dmitry served close to the ruler as a palace official and personal advisor. Maluta possessed influence through fear, violence, and command of the oprichnina. Each man had something the other could use. Their cooperation was not necessarily based on affection. It was an alliance built upon mutual advantage. Boris Godunov began his own service during the campaigns connected with Novgorod and later took part in military operations against the Tatars in 1572. He served in the same general military circle as Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, the eldest son of Ivan the Terrible. The two young men appear to have developed a friendly relationship after returning to court. For Boris, personal closeness to the heir of the throne offered a path to advancement far beyond anything his family had previously achieved. Maluta Skuratov understood the possibilities. To strengthen his association with Dmitry Godunov, he arranged the marriage of his daughter Maria Grigorievna to Boris. The union connected the young courtier to one of the most powerful men in Ivan IV's service. For Maluta, Boris was an attractive son-in-law. He was young, ambitious, and closely connected to the palace through his uncle. For the Godunovs, marriage into the Skuratov family provided protection during a period when a single accusation could lead to imprisonment, confiscation, or death. Both Dmitry Godunov and Maluta Skuratov sought an even greater prize: direct kinship with the ruling dynasty. Their first opportunity came when Tsarevich Ivan married Evdokia Saburova, a relative of Dmitry Godunov. The marriage appeared to bring the Godunovs closer to the throne. Yet the alliance did not last. After only a few years, Ivan IV rejected his daughter-in-law, sent her to a convent, and forced her to become a nun. In Muscovite Russia, this was a common method of ending an unwanted royal marriage without formally challenging orthodox restrictions on divorce. Boris continued advancing despite this setback. Once he reached adulthood, he entered the oprichnina and wore the distinctive clothing associated with its members. His uncle's influence helped him obtain the court rank of attorney or palace steward, a position that brought him into regular contact with the royal household. His service exposed him to a disturbing world of contradiction. The oprichniki participated in interrogations, confiscations, executions, and military campaigns. Yet their violence was often followed by extravagant feasts, drunken celebrations, religious ceremonies, and long periods of prayer. Ivan IV encouraged his followers to see themselves as both warriors and members of a sacred brotherhood. They could commit acts of cruelty during the day and spend the night observing monastic rituals. For a young man such as Boris, this combination of brutality, privilege, fear, and religious devotion must have created a deeply unstable environment. Later writers claimed that Boris received little formal education during these years. The chronicler, Ivan Timofeyev, portrayed him as almost illiterate and suggested that he never progressed far beyond recognizing letters. Other accounts were less severe. They maintained that Boris could read and write but preferred to rely upon clerks and secretaries. Among powerful noblemen, the ability to command trained scribes could matter more than personally preparing documents. It is therefore difficult to determine whether Boris lacked literacy or simply avoided displaying it. Whatever the truth, he developed other skills that proved far more important at court. He learned how to observe people, anticipate danger, manage rivalries, and conceal his intentions. These abilities would eventually carry him to the center of Russian government. The marriage of Boris and Maria produced several children. Their first son died in infancy, probably in 1588, though his name and exact year of birth were not preserved. Boris was deeply superstitious and reportedly distrusted physicians when the child became seriously ill. Instead, during the winter, he carried the boy to the Cathedral of St. Basil on Red Square. He hoped that the prayers of holy men or the sacred character of the site might bring healing. The journey failed to save the child. The death appears to have affected Boris greatly and strengthened the mixture of religious devotion and fear that marked much of his later life. His daughter Ksenia was born around 1580. A second son, Fyodor Borisovich, followed in 1589. Both children would eventually become central to the Godunov family's dynastic ambitions. The court conspiracies of Ivan the Terrible's reign destroyed many families, but the Godunovs repeatedly emerged in stronger positions. Yet one weakness remained. They still lacked a permanent blood relationship with the ruling house. In 1573, Boris suffered a major political loss. Maluta Skuratov was killed during the Livonian War, while taking part in an assault against a Swedish-held fortress. His death removed the man whose influence had done the most to accelerate Boris's early career. The compensation distributed afterward reflected the hierarchy within Maluta's extended household. His widow received 400 rubles. His nephew Bogdan Belsky was granted 250. Boris, despite being Maluta's son-in-law, received only 50 rubles. The difference revealed that Boris had not yet achieved the status of Maluta's closest relatives. With his father-in-law dead and the power of the Oprichnina beginning to decline, his future appeared uncertain. His relationship with Bogdan Belsky was particularly uneasy. The two men were connected through family, but neither fully trusted the other. Boris maintained the appearance of friendship because open hostility toward one of Ivan IV's favorites would have been dangerous. Survival at the court of Ivan the Terrible often depended upon such performances. Men smiled at rivals, praised enemies, and formed alliances they intended to abandon as soon as circumstances changed. Then the Godunovs received another opportunity. After several marriages of his own, Ivan IV decided that his younger son Fyodor should also take a wife. Dmitry Godunov immediately promoted his niece Irina as a suitable bride. Irina had grown up near the palace and had known Fyodor from childhood. She was also an orphan whose security depended upon the success of her relatives. Marriage to a Tsarevich offered protection, prestige, and the possibility of becoming the wife of a future ruler. Fyodor was widely regarded as physically fragile and poorly suited to the demands of government. Later descriptions also portrayed him as deeply religious, withdrawn, and uninterested in political affairs. These weaknesses did not discourage Dmitry or Irina. For the Godunovs, the marriage represented an extraordinary chance to enter the royal family. Fyodor and Irina were married in 1574. The union permanently changed Boris Godunov's position. He was no longer merely the nephew of a palace official or the son-in-law of a feared oprichnik. He had become the brother of the wife of a Russian prince. From that moment, the future of the Godunov family became inseparable from the fate of Tsarevich Fyodor. Dmitry Godunov continued to rise. Around 1575, Ivan IV granted him the rank of boyar. The title was not hereditary in itself, but it placed Dmitry among the highest members of the state elite and gave the family formal standing within the ruling council. Other Godunov relatives also entered important positions. When Ivan IV departed for another campaign in Livonia in 1577, he entrusted Tsarevich Fyodor to the care of Grigory Vasilievich Godunov. The appointment demonstrated how deeply the family had penetrated the royal household. By 1579, court records listed Boris among the members of Ivan IV's personal retinue. Significantly, his name appeared above that of Bogdan Belsky, the relative whose position had once surpassed his own. It was a small detail, but in the carefully ordered world of the Muscovite court, rank on an official list carried great meaning. It indicated that Boris was no longer merely protected by others. He had begun to establish an independent place among the men closest to the throne. His ascent had been built through calculated marriages, family connections, military service, palace appointments, and an extraordinary instinct for survival. Yet the greatest opportunities were still ahead. As Ivan the Terrible's reign approached its violent conclusion, the Godunovs were already positioned beside the weak prince who might soon inherit the Russian crown. When that moment arrived, Boris Godunov would no longer remain a minor courtier operating in the shadows. He would begin his transformation into the most powerful man in Russia. The death of Tsarevich Ivan in November 1581 transformed the political atmosphere of the Kremlin. According to the traditional account, the prince died after a violent confrontation with his father. Whether the fatal blow was delivered exactly as later chroniclers described or not, the consequences were unmistakable. Ivan the Terrible had lost his strongest and most capable heir, leaving the future of the dynasty dependent upon his younger son, Fyodor. By this stage, the Oprichnina had already lost much of its former structure and purpose. The private domain of terror that had once allowed Ivan to destroy powerful families was gradually being abandoned. For Boris Godunov, this change came at the perfect moment. He was no longer an obscure young servant protected by his uncle and father-in-law. He now held a position close to the ruler and, more importantly, was the brother of Tsarevich Fyodor's wife. Yet the marriage that had elevated the Godunovs also contained a serious weakness. Fyodor and Irina had been married for approximately 8 years, but they still had no surviving children. In a royal household, infertility was not merely a personal sorrow. It was a political crisis that threatened the continuation of the dynasty. Ivan IV became increasingly disturbed by the absence of an heir. After years of executions, wars, confiscations, and bloodshed, he may have wondered whether the extinction of his family was a form of divine punishment. The possibility that God had condemned his dynasty because of his reign of terror seems to have haunted him during his later years. As was customary in such situations, suspicion fell first upon the woman. Ivan considered dissolving Fyodor's marriage and finding another bride who might produce a son. He apparently gave little consideration to the possibility that Fyodor himself might be unable to father children. For Boris, the threat of divorce was extremely dangerous. His political importance rested largely upon Irina's position as the wife of the future Tsar. If she was sent to a convent and replaced by another woman, the Godunov family could lose its privileged access to the throne almost overnight. Boris therefore intervened with urgency. He was defending his sister, but he was also protecting his own future. Every position he had gained, every alliance he had formed, and every hope of further advancement depended upon preserving the marriage. Fyodor himself strongly resisted the idea of separation. He was deeply attached to Irina and had no desire to replace her. Unlike many royal marriages arranged entirely for political convenience, their union appears to have contained genuine affection. The prince's personal limitations were already evident to those around him. Fyodor was physically fragile, intensely religious, and largely uninterested in the practical burdens of government. Many contemporaries doubted whether he possessed the strength or judgment required to rule Russia independently. Ivan IV, however, seems to have refused to acknowledge the full extent of his son's weakness. Accepting that Fyodor was incapable of producing an heir or governing effectively would have meant confronting the possibility that the dynasty itself was approaching its end. The Tsar had already interfered disastrously in the marriages of his elder son. Tsarevich Ivan had been married 3 times, and each union had ended through his father's intervention. 2 wives were removed and forced into convents, while the fate of the third became entangled with the violent quarrel that preceded the prince's death. Perhaps remembering these events, Ivan finally abandoned the idea of separating Fyodor and Irina. He had already destroyed much of his elder son's domestic life and may have feared repeating the same pattern with the only adult heir who remained. Fyodor was therefore formally recognized as the principal successor to the throne, though Ivan's confidence in him was far from complete. The Tsar understood that his son would require powerful advisors to govern on his behalf. Then, late in Ivan's reign, another possible heir appeared. On October 19th, 1582, or according to some accounts in the following year, Ivan's last wife, Maria Nagaya, gave birth to a son named Dmitry Ivanovich. Maria came from a noble family connected with Uglich, a town north of Moscow near Yaroslavl. The region also lay relatively close to the Romanov lands around Kostroma. The birth of Dmitry created a new and potentially dangerous element within the succession. The child was still an infant, while Fyodor was the recognized adult heir. Yet Dmitry represented another surviving son of Ivan IV. As long as he lived, he could become a focus for factions dissatisfied with Fyodor, Irina, or the growing influence of Boris Godunov. There was also uncertainty surrounding the legitimacy of Dmitry's birth. Ivan had married several times, more than the Orthodox Church normally permitted. Depending upon how his previous marriages were counted, Maria Nagaya may have been considered his 6th or 7th wife. This raised questions about whether her son could legally inherit the throne. Such theological and legal doubts did not eliminate the political danger. In a dynastic struggle, supporters could ignore inconvenient rules whenever a surviving prince offered them a chance to challenge the ruling government. Ivan IV therefore faced a difficult problem. Fyodor was the lawful and recognized successor, but he lacked the qualities of a commanding ruler. Dmitry was too young to govern, and his legitimacy was uncertain. The survival of the state would depend upon the nobles surrounding the throne. In his final arrangements, Ivan established a group of senior figures who were expected to guide Fyodor after his accession. They represented some of the most powerful families in Russia and possessed the experience, wealth, and military authority required to stabilize the government. Ivan Fyodorovich Mstislavsky stood among the highest-ranking princes of the realm. His ancestry, court position, and long service made him one of the most respected members of the aristocracy. Ivan Petrovich Shwisky represented another ancient princely house. His military reputation and family prestige ensured that the Shwiskys could not easily be excluded from any future government. Nikita Romanov Yuriev Zakharin was connected to the ruling family through his sister Anastasia, Ivan IV's beloved first wife, and Fyodor's mother. His moderation and personal reputation made him a natural protector of the new Tsar. The fourth man was Boris Fyodorovich Godunov. Unlike the others, he did not descend from one of the oldest princely dynasties. His influence came from his sister's marriage, his years at court, and his ability to survive the violent politics of Ivan's reign. On the surface, these men were meant to cooperate. Together, they would compensate for Fyodor's weaknesses and protect the monarchy from disorder. In reality, the arrangement placed several ambitious families beside a ruler who lacked the strength to dominate them. The council was therefore not simply a safeguard, it was the beginning of a struggle. The Mstislavskys possessed rank. The Shwiskys possessed ancient blood and military prestige. The Romanovs possessed a close connection to Fyodor's mother. Boris possessed something less visible but increasingly decisive: direct access to Fyodor through Irina. As Ivan the Terrible approached the end of his life, Boris Godunov was perfectly positioned. He was not yet the master of Russia, and powerful rivals still surrounded him, but he stood closer than any of them to the man who would soon inherit the throne. The death of Ivan IV would not merely transfer the crown from father to son. It would open a contest over who would truly govern Russia. Fyodor would wear the crown, but the struggle to control the state was only beginning. Ivan IV, remembered by history as Ivan the Terrible, died on March 18, 1584. His death brought an end to one of the most violent and unpredictable reigns in Russian history. Yet the relief felt by many nobles was immediately overshadowed by a troubling question. The new ruler, Fyodor Ivanovich, possessed almost none of the qualities normally expected from a Tsar. At 27, Fyodor appeared physically frail and lacked the commanding presence associated with his father and earlier rulers of Moscow. He was short, heavily built, slow in movement, and often seemed uncomfortable in public ceremonies. His quiet manner and habitual smile gave him an air of harmlessness rather than authority. Contemporaries frequently described him as intellectually limited and dependent upon those around him. Modern certainty about his condition is impossible, but it was clear even to many at court that Fyodor struggled to follow complex political matters and showed little interest in government. His attention was directed instead toward religion. He spent long hours attending church services, visiting monasteries, listening to clergy, and participating in Orthodox rituals. Bells, prayers, pilgrimages, and religious processions interested him far more than military campaigns, taxation, or diplomacy. For Fyodor, political authority was not a prize to be desired. It was a dangerous responsibility that could expose a ruler to pride, violence, and sin. He seemed almost afraid of the power placed in his hands. This alarmed the boyars. Ivan IV had ruled through fear, but at least his will had dominated the state. Fyodor represented the opposite danger. Russia might now be governed by a man unable to restrain rival families, control ambitious officials, or impose his decisions upon the court. Many nobles therefore faced an uncomfortable choice. Ivan's tyranny had devastated the country, but Fyodor's weakness might allow Russia to collapse into factional struggle. No one could yet know which threat would prove more destructive. Fyodor himself seems to have viewed his reign differently. He believed that Russia could enter an age of peace after the bloodshed of his father's rule. To him, the end of terror appeared as a sign of divine mercy. After years of punishment, the country might finally receive forgiveness. Whether Fyodor fully understood the scale of the executions, tortures, confiscations, and massacres committed under Ivan remained uncertain. He had lived close to the court, but he often appeared detached from the brutal realities of power. The night Ivan died, the Boyar Duma moved quickly. Senior nobles assumed control of the government before uncertainty could spread across Moscow. Former Oprichnina officials were expelled from the capital, while those considered especially dangerous were arrested. Immediate attention also turned to the family of Ivan's final wife, Maria Nagaya. Her young son Dmitry was still only a child, but his existence created a possible alternative to Fyodor. The Nagoy family was suspected of hoping to promote Dmitry as the rightful heir. The boyars placed Maria's relatives under guard and secured the principal areas of the capital. Moscow was restless, and rumors spread rapidly through the streets. Soldiers patrolled during the night, while cannon crews were stationed in the city squares in case disorder became open rebellion. The leading nobles then swore loyalty to Fyodor Ivanovich. By morning, messengers were sent throughout the provinces with orders that prayers should be offered for the soul of Ivan IV and for the peaceful reign of his successor. A wider assembly of nobles, princes, church leaders, and provincial representatives was summoned. The purpose was not simply to confirm Fyodor's accession. Russia had been exhausted by years of war, terror, confiscation, and administrative disorder. The new government needed to restore stability and reduce the pressure placed upon the population. Fyodor's coronation was scheduled for May 31st, after the traditional mourning period and memorial ceremonies for his father. Before that ceremony, however, the most dangerous questions surrounding the succession had to be settled. Maria Nagaya and the young Dmitry were ordered to leave Moscow. Along with Maria's father, brothers, and other members of the Nagoy family, they were sent to Uglich, a town on the Volga near Yaroslavl. The removal was presented with all the outward respect due to a royal widow and the son of a Tsar. Maria received servants, cooks, attendants, household officials, and a nurse for Dmitry. Their residence was supplied in a manner suitable for members of the dynasty. Yet, the luxury could not disguise the reality. Maria and Dmitry had been placed in a carefully supervised exile, far from the political center of Moscow. Fyodor reportedly said farewell to his young half-brother with visible sadness. His tears suggested that the decision had not been entirely his own. The boyars now directing affairs had judged Dmitry's continued presence in the Kremlin too dangerous. One man who had originally been expected to accompany the child was Bogdan Belsky. Ivan IV had chosen him to serve as Dmitry's guardian and mentor. Belsky, however, remained in Moscow, claiming that his experience would be more useful in the Boyar Duma. His decision soon provoked suspicion. While the Nagoy family departed from the capital in a procession of royal splendor, Moscow was already entering another crisis. Belsky ordered the Kremlin gates closed and began relying upon his connections among the guards and former members of the Oprichnina. He appears to have hoped that he could weaken the Boyar Duma, control the new Tsar, and govern Russia in Fyodor's name. His past position within Ivan's inner circle and his influence among armed retainers made such an attempt possible. Rumors spread rapidly that Fyodor's life was in danger. Belsky's name was mentioned everywhere. Some accused him of planning to poison the new ruler, destroy the leading boyar families, and restore the machinery of the Oprichnina. Other rumors revived older accusations that he had somehow been involved in the death of Tsarevich Ivan, even though the prince's fatal confrontation had been with his own father. In the atmosphere of fear left behind by Ivan's reign, evidence mattered less than suspicion. The Romanovs and Mstislavskis firmly opposed any attempt to revive the Oprichnina under Belsky's command. The Shuisky princes, meanwhile, were accused of deliberately encouraging unrest among the people of Moscow. Members of the Lyapunov and Kievan families added fuel to the anger. They told the crowds that they were prepared to save the Tsar from Belsky's schemes. The result was an explosion. Thousands of armed residents, craftsmen, servants, soldiers, and members of the urban population surged toward the Kremlin. Contemporary accounts place their number at around 20,000, although such figures may have been exaggerated. The Kremlin gates were closed only moments before the crowd reached them. Guards climbed the walls, while the demonstrators seized artillery from posts around the city and aimed the guns toward the fortress entrances. The capital stood on the edge of civil conflict. Fyodor, terrified by the uprising, ordered Prince Ivan Mstislavsky, Nikita Romanov, and the officials Andrei and Vasily Shelkolov to appear before the crowd. From the Kremlin walls, they asked what the people wanted. The reply came with a single name: Belsky. The crowd demanded that he be surrendered, accusing him of plotting to destroy the royal dynasty and murder the great noble families. Thousands of voices repeated the demand until it echoed across the Kremlin walls. Bogdan Belsky suddenly found himself isolated. He had remained in Moscow because he believed it offered greater political opportunity. Now he regretted not leaving with Dmitry and the Nagoy household. Fearing the crowd, he sought refuge inside the former apartments of Ivan IV. There, according to later accounts, he hid and prayed while the leading boyars debated how to prevent violence. Boris Godunov and the other nobles understood that the accusations against Belsky were not entirely without foundation. Yet handing him directly to the mob would have weakened the authority of the government and perhaps encouraged further uprisings. Negotiations began between representatives of the Kremlin and leaders of the crowd. A compromise was eventually reached. Belsky would not be executed, but he would be removed from Moscow immediately. He was sent to Nizhny Novgorod, where he received the post of military governor. The appointment allowed the government to present his departure as a reassignment rather than an admission of treason. Once the exile was announced, the crowd accepted the decision. Shouts of loyalty to the Tsar and his trusted nobles replaced the earlier cries for blood. The armed residents slowly dispersed, and Moscow returned to an uneasy calm. The revolt left a deep impression upon Fyodor. It revealed how quickly rumors could bring thousands of people into the streets and how vulnerable the Kremlin had become after Ivan's death. Fyodor understood that severe measures might sometimes be necessary to protect the capital, yet he lacked the confidence and determination to direct such measures himself. He needed more than an advisor. He needed someone willing to carry the burden of government in his place. His wife Irina understood this better than anyone. She loved Fyodor and recognized both his gentle character and his inability to manage the affairs of the state. She therefore encouraged him to depend upon the man she trusted most, her brother, Boris Godunov. Boris had spent years within the palace. He understood the rivalries of the boyars, the fears of the royal family, and the machinery of government. He had served in military campaigns, survived the Oprichnina, and learned how decisions were made in Moscow and enforced in the provinces. The transfer of influence was never publicly declared. Fyodor remained the crowned ruler, and official commands continued to appear in his name. Yet, behind the ceremonies of monarchy, real authority gradually moved toward Boris. Irina supported this arrangement without openly presenting it as a seizure of power. From her perspective, the state required someone capable of making decisions that her husband could not make. She was nevertheless aware of her brother's ambition. Boris did not merely wish to serve. He wanted influence, recognition, and eventually a position that no ordinary boyar had ever held. At 32, he was entering the strongest period of his life. He possessed energy, intelligence, political experience, and a talent for understanding the weaknesses of other men. Boris also knew how to present himself. He could appear dignified and severe when firmness was required, yet compassionate and generous when kindness offered greater advantage. His speech was persuasive, and he had learned to flatter nobles without making his intentions obvious. His generosity was rarely without purpose. He distributed money, rewards, and favors, but expected loyalty, gratitude, and public admiration in return. Charity, for Boris, was not merely a moral act. It was a political investment. These methods had been refined at the court of Ivan the Terrible. Boris had watched men rise through obedience, fall through carelessness, and die because they misunderstood the mood of the ruler. He had learned that open ambition was dangerous, but concealed ambition could become irresistible. His first important demonstration of authority came soon after the Moscow uprising. Zachary and Prokopy Lyapunov, members of the Kievan family, and several other men blamed for stirring the crowd, were arrested or exiled to distant towns, and some were imprisoned after their removal from the capital. The speed of the punishment surprised the Boyar Duma. Fyodor had not yet even been crowned, yet Boris was already acting with the confidence of a ruler. The nobles quickly understood who had ordered the measures. Many were disturbed that Godunov had assumed such authority without waiting for the formal beginning of the new reign. the population remained largely silent. Some believed that the punishments had come directly from Tsar Fyodor. Others may have understood that a new power was emerging behind the throne. At the same time, another distant member of the ruling family returned to Russia. Marfa, daughter of Prince Vladimir Andreevich of Staritsa and a relative of Ivan IV, came back with her infant daughter after the death of her Livonian husband. During Ivan's lifetime, her royal ancestry could have made her return dangerous. After his death, she believed it was safe to enter Russia again. She promised to behave with the dignity and restraint expected from someone connected to the ruling dynasty. Her arrival was another reminder that the end of Ivan's reign had not solved Russia's dynastic problems. Fyodor sat upon the throne, but young Dmitry lived in Uglich. Distant royal relatives were returning from abroad, and the great noble families were watching one another closely. For the moment, the country remained calm. The terror of Ivan IV had ended, the oprichnina had been scattered, and the new Tsar promised peace. Yet beneath the surface, power was already shifting. Fyodor possessed the crown, Irina possessed his trust, and Boris Godunov was beginning to govern Russia. The morning of May 31st, 1584, began beneath a violent spring storm. Heavy rain swept across Moscow, flooding streets and courtyards just as preparations were being completed for the coronation of Fyodor Ivanovich. To a population deeply sensitive to signs and omens, the weather appeared threatening. Some whispered that the storm foretold instability, suffering, or disaster under the new reign. Then, almost as suddenly as it had begun, the rain weakened. The clouds broke apart, sunlight spread across the city, and the dark omen seemed to transform into a promise of renewal. Many chose to interpret the clearing sky as evidence that God had accepted the new ruler. By then, an immense crowd had gathered in and around Red Square. The streets near the Kremlin were so densely packed that officials struggled to create a passage through the people. Noblemen, merchants, soldiers, craftsmen, peasants, servants, and visitors from the provinces all attempted to witness the sacred ceremony. The coronation began with the sound of bells ringing from churches throughout Moscow. Their echoes rolled across the rooftops as the ancient symbols of Russian monarchy were carried from the palace toward the Cathedral of the Assumption. These objects were associated with Vladimir Monomakh and the sacred continuity of the Muscovite throne. Whether every item truly dated from his reign mattered less than what they represented. They proclaimed that the rulers of Moscow were the heirs of the old princes of Rus and the guardians of an ancient political and religious tradition. At the head of the procession walked Fyodor's confessor and senior churchman. They carried the 8-pointed Orthodox cross, the royal crown, the ceremonial mantle, and other sacred regalia. Boris Godunov followed behind them holding the scepter. The placement was significant. Even before the ceremony had formally crowned Fyodor, Boris appeared close to the symbols of sovereignty. Then the new ruler emerged from the palace. Fyodor was accompanied by boyars, military commanders, priests, court officials, and members of the royal household. The noise of the crowd diminished as the procession passed. People pushed forward to see the man who had inherited the throne of Ivan the Terrible. The ceremony was conducted by Metropolitan Dionysius of Moscow. Under the sunlight entering the cathedral and reflecting from the precious stones sewn into his garments, Fyodor appeared surrounded by gold, jewels, silk, and sacred imagery. The Kremlin was opened so that the crowd could move through designated areas and catch a glimpse of the royal procession. A limited number of ordinary townspeople and peasants were also allowed inside the cathedral. Their presence symbolized the participation of the entire Russian people in the enthronement of the new Tsar. The cathedral officials, however, had difficulty maintaining order among those unfamiliar with court ceremony. Deacons moved through the aisles, reminding the visitors to remain quiet, pray respectfully, and behave with proper reverence. Near the western entrance, Fyodor and Metropolitan Dionysius took their places. When the voices of the crowd had faded and the cathedral became silent, the Tsar rose to address the head of the Russian Church. He declared that his father, Ivan Vasilievich, had departed from earthly rule and entered the heavenly kingdom. Before his death, Ivan had blessed Fyodor with authority over the Russian state and had commanded that he be anointed according to ancient custom. Fyodor stated that his father's testament was known to the clergy, the aristocracy, and the people. By divine will and paternal blessing, he now requested that the sacred rite be completed and that he be crowned as Tsar. The Metropolitan raised the cross above him and proclaimed Fyodor the chosen ruler of God, the beloved son of the Church, and the sovereign appointed to govern all Russia. Dionysius then placed the cross associated with Monomach around Fyodor's neck. The ceremonial mantle was laid upon his shoulders, and the crown was set upon his head, while prayers were offered for the prosperity and protection of his reign. Taking Fyodor by the hand, the Metropolitan led him toward the traditional royal seat used during cathedral services. He placed the scepter in the Tsar's hand and instructed him to guard the state entrusted to him. The archdeacons, standing upon the raised platform, began proclaiming long life to the ruler. Priests, choristers, and clergy joined them until the cathedral filled with music. When the coronation hymns ended, Metropolitan Dionysius delivered a long instruction on the responsibilities of monarchy. The Tsar, he declared, must preserve law, maintain the government, protect the Orthodox faith, and respect the spiritual authority of the Church. He was expected to support monasteries, honor the great noble families, show consideration towards soldiers and officials, and govern ordinary subjects with justice. The Metropolitan reminded Fyodor that rulers exercised power only because God had entrusted them with the fate of human beings. A monarch was therefore responsible not merely for military victory or political order, but for the moral condition of the country. Without wise leadership, he warned, the people would remain in darkness just as the earth remained dark without the sun. Fyodor was urged to love wisdom, pursue peace, reject slander, show mercy, and restrain those who used authority for cruelty. Kindness, Dionysius declared, was not a weakness in a ruler. It was one of the greatest ornaments of kingship and the foundation of lasting honor. If Fyodor treated his subjects with compassion, heaven would look upon him with compassion. If he upheld justice, Russia would enjoy rest. If he governed faithfully, God would strengthen his hand against every enemy and preserve the state for future generations. The words moved many in the cathedral. Tears appeared on the faces of nobles, priests, and ordinary spectators. Voices rose around Fyodor, wishing him a long and prosperous reign. Yet beneath the grandeur, the physical burden of the ceremony was beginning to overwhelm the new Tsar. The crown was heavy. The mantle weighed upon his shoulders. The scepter, traditionally said to have been fashioned from whalebone, had to be held throughout the long prayers and declarations. Fyodor, already physically weak, became visibly exhausted. Standing near him were the men upon whom his government would depend. Boris Godunov occupied a place of honor beside the throne. Nikita Romanov and Dmitry Godunov also stood nearby, along with the highest-ranking princes and officials of the realm. Before Fyodor's seat stood a table displaying crowns and other symbols associated with kingdoms defeated or claimed by his father. They were intended to remind the audience that the new ruler inherited not only a throne, but the victories and imperial ambitions of Ivan IV. Witnesses described the interior of the cathedral as more magnificent than anything previously seen in Moscow. The raised areas used by the clergy were covered with fine material, while the floor was decorated with Persian carpets and brightly colored English cloth. The garments of the aristocracy added to the spectacle. Boris Godunov and Prince Ivan Glinsky, a relative of the Tsar, wore robes covered with pearls, diamonds, precious stones, and embroidered ornament. Foreign observers claimed that the clothing displayed during the ceremony was worth an extraordinary fortune. Such estimates were probably exaggerated, but they reflected the impression created by the wealth of the Russian court. The final stages of the ritual reinforced the sacred character of Fyodor's kingship. Metropolitan Dionysius placed a heavy golden chain associated with Monomach around his neck. The Tsar was then anointed with holy oil and received the Eucharist. By this point, Fyodor was too tired to continue holding the symbols of power. He returned the scepter to Boris Godunov and removed the crown from his head. Nikita Romanov held the golden plate upon which it was placed. The image was striking. The newly crowned ruler had surrendered the scepter to the man who was already becoming the true organizer of the government. Fyodor then approached the tombs of his royal ancestors. There, he prayed that he might inherit their blessings and govern with the favor that had preserved their dynasty. During the ceremony, Tsaritsa Irina sat among the noble women wearing a crown of her own. Her position was already more important than that of an ordinary royal consort. Through her influence over Fyodor and her loyalty to Boris, she stood at the center of the emerging political order. When the royal couple left the cathedral, coins were scattered among the people. The gesture represented generosity and the promise that the new reign would be gentler than the one that had preceded it. The crowd praised Irina and reached toward Fyodor to kiss his hand. Mounted cavalry escorted the couple back toward the palace as the thunder of artillery erupted across the Kremlin. A total of 170 cannon shots were reportedly fired in celebration. The noise rolled over Moscow, announcing that the age of Ivan the Terrible had ended and the reign of Fyodor had formally begun. The first public measures of the new government were designed to create an atmosphere of reconciliation. Although every important act was officially attributed to Fyodor, Boris Godunov was already deeply involved in shaping policy. Prisoners and exiles who had survived Ivan's purges were released. Among them were leading princes, military commanders, and members of families that had once been considered enemies of the crown. Dmitry Kvorostinin regained his freedom. The Shuisky brothers Andrei and Vasily Ivanovich were permitted to return, as were Nikita Trubetskoy, Fyodor Sheremetev, members of the Kuryakin family, Shestunov, and other prominent nobles. Ivan Petrovich Shuisky was also restored, along with several of Boris Godunov's own relatives, including Ivan, Dmitry, and Stepan Godunov. Some of these men had spent many years in exile or confinement. Their hereditary lands and estates were returned, allowing families broken by the previous reign to rebuild their political and economic position. The amnesty extended beyond the aristocracy. Prisoners taken during Ivan's wars against Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, Kazan, Astrakhan, and the Crimean Tatars were also released. The purpose was practical as well as symbolic. By freeing captives and restoring confiscated property, the government hoped to reduce resentment, reunite noble households, and demonstrate that the era of arbitrary punishment had come to an end. Yet no one benefited from the new reign as greatly as Boris Godunov. Fyodor granted his brother-in-law titles, lands, revenues, and privileges on an extraordinary scale. Boris encouraged these rewards by presenting them as necessary for the security of the throne. The stronger his position became, he argued, the more effectively he could protect the Tsar and stabilize the country. He received the ancient office of Master of the Horse, one of the most prestigious ranks in the Russian court. The title had remained vacant for many years, which made its revival in Boris's favor especially significant. He was also named governor or regent over the territories of Kazan and Astrakhan, two of the most important regions conquered during Ivan IV's reign. These titles placed Boris above nearly every other member of the aristocracy. They gave him ceremonial authority, administrative control, and access to enormous financial resources. His official salary alone was said to reach 175,000 rubles annually, though figures from the period must be treated cautiously. In addition, he received rich lands in the northern regions along the Vaga River, together with forests, meadows, villages, and agricultural estates. He gained income from territories along the Moscow River and from taxation collected in Moscow, Ryazan, Tver, and several northern provinces. Revenues from Kazan and Astrakhan were also placed under his control. His family already possessed estates in Vyazma and Dorogobuj, so the new grants transformed him into one of the wealthiest men in Europe. Later writers claimed that his total annual income may have reached between 800,000 and 900,000 silver rubles. The exact amount is impossible to verify, and such estimates were probably intended to emphasize the almost unimaginable scale of his fortune. What is clear is that no other Russian subject possessed such a combination of wealth, political access, and territorial power. His estates supported a vast population of peasants, servants, retainers, and military dependents. In theory, he could raise an enormous private force from the lands under his authority. Estimates of 100,000 men were likely exaggerated, but the military resources available to him were still exceptional. Boris used his fortune carefully. He gave large donations to monasteries and churches, supported religious construction, distributed aid to the poor, and assisted communities struck by fire, famine, or other disasters. His annual charitable spending was itself said to be enormous, yet his generosity always carried a political dimension. Gifts created gratitude. Donations strengthened his reputation. Public relief allowed him to present himself as the protector of people neglected by the old regime. Under Ivan IV, fear had been the principal language of government. Boris Godunov was developing a different method. He would rule through access, reward, spectacle, patronage, and carefully managed mercy. Fyodor had received the crown of monarch. But during the coronation itself, the exhausted Tsar had placed the scepter back into Boris's hands. The gesture may have been practical and momentary. It also revealed the political reality of the new reign. The death of a feared ruler often brings a brief season of relief. After years of uncertainty, punishment, and violence, people naturally begin to hope that the worst has passed. Yet the end of tyranny does not always produce strong government. A new monarch, determined not to resemble his predecessor, may move too far in the opposite direction and allow the authority of the state to weaken. This was the concern that followed the death of Ivan the Terrible. The people of Muscovite Russia had suffered deeply under Ivan IV. His violence had not been limited to a single class or region. Noble families had been destroyed, towns had been devastated, estates had been confiscated, and entire communities had lived under the shadow of the oprichnina. Even those who escaped direct persecution suffered from the endless demands of war. Russia had fought against Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, the Crimean Tatars, the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, and forces connected with the Ottoman world. These conflicts consumed money, exhausted military resources, disrupted agriculture, and placed a heavy burden upon ordinary people. When Ivan died, the country inherited a damaged administration, an unstable economy, and a population desperate for peace. Yet the new Tsar, Fyodor Ivanovich, inspired little confidence as a political leader. His gentleness appeared admirable after the brutality of his father, but his timidity, religious withdrawal, and lack of interest in royal ceremony worried many officials. He seemed uncomfortable with the very idea of command. The majesty of the monarchy meant little to him compared with prayer, pilgrimage, and the rituals of the Orthodox Church. Under these circumstances, the government required someone who could act in Fyodor's name while restoring order to the state. Boris Godunov emerged as that man. One of his earliest economic decisions was to suspend the creation of new tax privileges. During the previous reign, wealthy individuals, monasteries, and influential institutions had often obtained exemptions that shifted the financial burden onto others. Boris concluded that Russia could not recover while more property was being removed from taxation. Until the economy improved, no new exemption would be granted. The measure was simple but important. It showed that the new administration intended to rebuild state income rather than continue distributing privileges as rewards for loyalty. Boris also restored regularity to the central government. The Boyar Duma began meeting every Friday. Tsar Fyodor occupied the throne, preserving the appearance that he personally directed affairs. Senior churchmen sat together at one table, while nobles and state officials gathered at another. An official introduced each matter requiring discussion. Opinions were then presented, objections were heard, and a decision was reached. Once the issue had been settled, the appropriate departments prepared and issued the decree. The arrangement gave the government a sense of order that had often been absent during Ivan's later years. Yet, although Fyodor presided over the meetings, it was Boris who increasingly determined which questions were discussed and how they would be resolved. The administration was divided among several important departments. The ambassadorial office handled diplomacy and communication with foreign states. The military distribution office organized military appointments, regimental commands, and questions of rank. The land office managed estates and service lands, while the Kazan office supervised affairs in the eastern territories and relations with neighboring peoples. A separate palace office dealt with the royal household, court property, and the practical management of the Kremlin. With the oprichnina finally dissolved, Boris also reorganized the armed forces. The division between the ordinary state and Ivan's private military domain was removed. Russia could once again direct its manpower through a more unified command. The standing military establishment was said to include around 80,000 cavalrymen and 12,000 streltsy infantry. Approximately 5,000 of these guards were stationed in Moscow. In an emergency, additional troops could be called from the provinces, greatly increasing the size of the army. Contemporary estimates sometimes claimed that Russia could assemble 250,000 men within days. Such figures were probably exaggerated, but they reflected the enormous military resources available to the Muscovite state. During Fyodor's reign, Russian expansion continued in several directions. In the northwest, influence pushed toward Karelia and Lapland. In the east, Russian settlements and fortresses advanced beyond the Urals into western Siberia. In the south, control over the lower Volga and Astrakhan was strengthened. Arkhangelsk emerged in the far north as an important port connecting Russia with the White Sea. Tobolsk was established in 1587 and became the principal Russian center in Siberia. Additional fortifications and administrative settlements appeared across the expanding frontier. By the end of Fyodor's reign, Muscovite territory had grown dramatically. Russia still lacked control over much of Ukraine and Belarus, but its influence now extended across most of the lands that would later form the European heart of the empire and deep into western Siberia. These gains strengthened the government, but they also increased the power of the man directing it. Boris trusted Fyodor personally. The Tsar was his brother-in-law and depended heavily upon him. Yet Boris never felt secure. His rapid rise had created jealousy among hereditary princes and senior boyars who believed that their ancestry entitled them to greater authority. Some accepted him reluctantly. Others waited for an opportunity to destroy him. Boris understood that naked ambition would unite his rivals. He therefore presented his dominance as public service. Rather than openly claiming superiority over the ancient families, he concentrated on measures that benefited the population and restored the state. If ordinary Russians came to regard him as the protector of peace, prosperity, and justice, then opposition to him could be portrayed as opposition to the welfare of the country. His authority gradually altered the balance within the ruling council established by Ivan IV. Nikita Romanov, Ivan Mstislavsky, and Vasily Shvisky had originally been expected to share responsibility for guiding Fyodor. Under Boris, they increasingly became advisors rather than equals. Bogdan Belsky was already in exile. The remaining senior nobles still possessed prestige, but they no longer directed policy independently. Boris listened to them when useful and ignored them when necessary. To the public, this concentration of authority appeared reasonable. Fyodor was gentle but weak, while Boris seemed energetic, intelligent, and capable of guiding the state through danger. Many began to believe that only he could hold the political machinery together. He officially acted for the Tsar and claimed no crown of his own. Yet in practice, he governed without true partners. He had counselors, supporters, and relatives, but few people he regarded as equals. His relationship with the Shvisky family demonstrated his careful approach. Boris publicly reconciled with Vasily Shvisky and his younger brother Dmitry. The families were already connected through marriage, since Dmitry had married Ekaterina, another daughter of Maluta Skuratov, and therefore the sister of Boris's wife Maria. Boris rewarded Dmitry Shvisky with promotion to the rank of boyar. The gesture appeared generous and strengthened the appearance of harmony between two powerful households. At the same time, Boris advanced members of his own family. His cousins Dmitry, Ivan, and Stepan Godunov received boyar rank and places in the Duma. His relatives were gradually positioned throughout the administration, ensuring that important offices were held by men whose careers depended upon him. Boris also turned his attention toward local government. Corrupt judges, provincial officials, and administrators were investigated and removed. Some were retrained or transferred, while others were dismissed entirely. New appointees were warned that bribery and abuse could bring imprisonment, exile, or even death. Siberia, still distant and harsh in the Russian imagination, became an especially useful threat. At the same time, Boris recognized why many officials accepted bribes. Government salaries were often too low to support them, encouraging administrators to extract money from the population. He therefore increased their pay, in some cases doubling it, hoping that better compensation would reduce the temptation to steal. The reform did not eliminate corruption, but it reflected a more practical approach to administration. Boris preferred to create incentives for obedience while preserving severe punishment for those who continued to abuse their offices. Military regiments were reorganized and stationed in regions where they could protect borders, suppress banditry, and respond quickly to local unrest. One of the first major challenges appeared around Kazan and the Middle Volga. Fighting continued between Russian forces and the Mari people, known in older Russian sources as the Cheremis. Resistance had persisted for decades after Ivan IV's conquest of Kazan. Instead of relying only upon military force, Boris offered negotiation. He promised that Tsar Fyodor, as the merciful father of the country, would forgive those who laid down their weapons and accepted Russian authority. The message contrasted sharply with the methods of Ivan the Terrible. Mari elders were invited to select representatives and send them to Moscow. There, they pledged loyalty to Fyodor and accepted the terms of peace. The government then constructed new forts and settlements along both sides of the Volga. Russian families were encouraged to relocate through land grants, financial advantages, and temporary privileges. The forts strengthened military control, but the settlement policy was equally important. It created permanent Russian communities that supported trade, agriculture, taxation, and administration. By 1587, the region had achieved a degree of stability not seen since the opening campaigns against Kazan in the early 1550s. Farther east, the conquest of Siberia continued. There, Boris relied more heavily upon force. Better organized regiments advanced into territories previously entered by Cossack expeditions and private adventurers. Native rulers and tribal alliances were defeated or compelled to recognize Russian authority. By 1587, Tobolsk had been established as the main administrative center of the Siberian frontier. Its location allowed the government to supervise rivers, trade routes, military expeditions, and the collection of tribute. Russian farmers and settlers were moved eastward from regions such as Perm, Vyatka, Kargopol, and the lands near the Urals. The government expected them to cultivate fields, build villages, and provide supplies for future expansion. The occupation of Western Siberia would become one of the most important developments in Russian history. The region offered enormous forests, rivers, hunting grounds, minerals, and access to the fur trade. Relations with the indigenous population varied. Some communities resisted and faced military attack. Others entered agreements with Russian officials, paid tribute, and participated in trade. Large territories were sometimes reserved for native groups, although their autonomy depended entirely upon the demands of the expanding state. Russian administrators encouraged them to exchange furs, livestock, and local products for metal goods, cloth, grain, and other supplies. Expansion was accompanied by commerce. In 1587, Boris strengthened trade with England. English merchants already viewed the northern sea route as a way to reach Russia without passing through territory controlled by rival European powers. The agreement reportedly cost the English treasury around £2,000 annually in payments, privileges, or commercial expenses. In return, English vessels were given access to northern Russian markets. The route was difficult and could generally be used only during the summer. Ships crossed the White Sea and arrived near the mouth of the northern Dvina, close to Arkhangelsk. From there, merchandise traveled inland along the river system. Goods were carried through Vologda, moved across land where necessary, and then transported toward Yaroslavl and Moscow using rivers, roads, and tributaries of the Volga. The journey was long, but it created a valuable commercial connection between Russia and Western Europe. English merchants brought metals, weapons, cloth, and manufactured goods. Russian exports included furs, wax, timber, rope materials, and other raw products. Foreign trade was important, but the most difficult diplomatic issue remained Poland-Lithuania. Ivan IV had spent much of his reign fighting for control of Livonia, the region corresponding largely to modern Estonia and Latvia. Access to the Baltic Sea was essential for trade and communication with Europe, but the Livonian War had become a prolonged disaster. Russia fought against several enemies, including Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden. Decades of campaigning exhausted the treasury and destroyed many regiments. In January 1582, Ivan had accepted a peace agreement with Stephen Bathory, ruler of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Russia surrendered its claims and conquests in Livonia, losing the territorial gains for which it had fought so long. A separate arrangement with Sweden in 1583 left Russia with only limited access toward the Baltic through territories connected with the Neva. Bathory did not consider the peace permanent. To him, the treaty offered time to rebuild his forces and prepare for another confrontation. Ivan's death appeared to create an opportunity. The new Tsar was known to be weak, and the government was still reorganizing itself. Bathory hoped that Moscow could be intimidated into making further concessions. He sent the diplomat Lou Sapieha to the Russian capital with a series of demands. Russia was expected to pay an enormous sum for the release of Russian prisoners. The government was also asked to free Lithuanian captives and compensate subjects of the Commonwealth who had suffered during the wars. Fyodor responded that he had already released hundreds of Polish, Hungarian, and German prisoners during the celebrations surrounding his coronation. He urged Bathory to act with the same Christian charity and return Russian prisoners without demanding payment. The meeting produced no final settlement. Both sides agreed only to extend the existing truce for several additional months. Boris had no desire to resume a major Western war while Russia was still recovering. He therefore continued negotiations. A few years later, he sent Prince Fyodor Troyekurovich and the nobleman Mikhail Beznin to Warsaw. Their task was to persuade Bathory that continued peace benefited both states. Reports about Boris's government had already reached the Polish court. He had developed a reputation for punishing criminal behavior quickly and maintaining discipline within Russia. Bathory understood that the new administration might be more capable than Fyodor's personal weakness suggested. The Russian delegates were received and returned with an agreement extending the truce for another 2 years. Yet Bathory had not abandoned his territorial ambitions. Memories of the long war remained fresh, and he continued exploring ways to obtain Russian lands through negotiation or future military pressure. Then, events brought his plans to an end. Stephen Bathory died on December 12, 1586. His death removed one of Russia's most determined opponents. No major territory changed hands in the immediate aftermath, although both sides gradually released additional prisoners. For Boris, the outcome was a diplomatic victory. Russia had avoided another exhausting war without surrendering further land. Within only a few years, the government had restored internal order, strengthened the army, expanded into Siberia, pacified the Volga region, encouraged northern trade, and preserved peace with Poland-Lithuania. Fyodor remained the sacred and lawful Tsar. But behind nearly every reform, negotiation, military appointment, and administrative decision stood Boris Godunov. He had not taken the throne. He had made himself indispensable to it. The early achievements of Boris Godunov proved that he possessed both intelligence and political discipline. Under his direction, the government restored order, strengthened the frontiers, reopened trade, and began repairing the damage left by decades of war and repression. Yet success did not make Boris secure. It made him more dangerous in the eyes of his rivals. Many of Russia's oldest noble families still regarded him as an outsider who had risen far above his proper station. They remembered the tradition that traced the Godunov family to a Tatar ancestor and resented seeing a man without ancient princely blood dominate descendants of the old rulers of Moscow, Suzdal, and Vladimir. To these hereditary princes, Boris's authority represented more than personal humiliation. It appeared to overturn the established hierarchy of the realm. Families that had served beside grand princes for generations now found themselves receiving instructions from the son of a provincial landowner and the son-in-law of Maluta Skuratov. Boris attempted to present himself as modest and dutiful. He spoke as if every decision were made only for the benefit of Tsar Fyodor and the Russian state. The aristocracy was not deceived. Supporters praised him cautiously, while enemies listened closely for evidence of hidden ambition. His connection to Maluta Skuratov remained especially damaging. Although Boris tried to distance himself from the brutality of the Oprichnina, his marriage tied him permanently to one of Ivan the Terrible's most feared servants. His opponents believed that beneath the language of mercy and reform stood another potential tyrant. The more Boris accomplished, the deeper their envy became. Russia's recovery strengthened his public reputation, while every successful reform weakened the political position of the ancient houses. Boris understood that he could not rule securely while openly opposed by the Shuisky family. The Shuiskys descended from the old princes of Suzdal and possessed immense prestige among the nobility, the army, and the population of Moscow. He therefore sought an accommodation with them. The Shuiskys, Mstislavskys, Lyapunovs, and other leading families felt no similar need for reconciliation. They believed that Boris depended upon Fyodor's weakness and Irina's influence, while they possessed rank and ancestry independent of royal favor. The hostility soon became public. Metropolitan Dionysius attempted to intervene before the conflict divided the court completely. He invited the opposing leaders to meet at the Chudov monastery within the Kremlin. Speaking as a representative of both the church and the fatherland, he urged them to abandon personal hatred and cooperate for the preservation of Russia. His words appeared to have the desired effect. Boris displayed humility and offered his hand to Prince Ivan Petrovich Shuisky. Before the Metropolitan, the two men promised to live in peace, respect one another's interests, and work together for the prosperity of the state. Prince Ivan left the meeting smiling. He crossed the Kremlin square toward the government chambers and announced that the quarrel between the two houses had ended. The news brought visible relief to the people gathered nearby. Many feared that rivalry among the boyars might plunge Russia into another period of purges, conspiracies, and civil violence. The possibility of a restored oprichnina still haunted the public imagination. Ivan Shuisky's personal reputation made his assurance especially powerful. He was remembered as the defender of Pskov, the commander who had resisted the armies of Stephen Bathory during the Livonian War. To many Russians, he represented courage, military honor, and loyalty to the state. The crowd listened respectfully as he declared that peace had been restored. Then two Moscow merchants stepped forward and issued a warning. They told the prince that the reconciliation had been made at the expense of their lives. Boris, they predicted, would eventually destroy both the Shuiskys and those who trusted them. The warning was dangerous because it expressed what many people privately suspected. That same night, the two merchants were arrested on Boris's orders and sent into exile. Their final destination was not recorded. The incident revealed the reality behind the public reconciliation. Boris and the Shuiskys had exchanged promises, but neither side had abandoned its suspicions. Their friendship existed only as long as it was politically useful. The Russian Orthodox Church had rarely sought direct control of the state. Its senior clergy generally accepted the authority of the sovereign and concentrated upon worship, doctrine, education, and the spiritual life of society. Church leaders occasionally attended meetings of the Boyar Duma when an issue involved religious law or the privileges of monasteries. They advised the ruler and the nobility, but did not normally govern alongside them. Their influence, however, depended greatly upon the personality of the Tsar. A strong monarch could limit clerical involvement. A weak ruler might rely upon spiritual advisors so heavily that they gained access to political decisions. Fyodor's character created precisely this opportunity. He preferred the company of monks to that of soldiers and administrators. He discussed spiritual concerns more readily than taxation, diplomacy, or military policy. Metropolitan Dionysius, an intelligent and sincere churchman, gradually became one of the people closest to him. Dionysius recognized that Fyodor wished to increase the privileges of churches and monasteries. He also sensed that the Tsar might allow the Metropolitan a larger role in government. Boris had no intention of permitting this. He had spent years accumulating authority and was not prepared to share it with the clergy. He treated senior churchmen with outward respect, offered gifts, listened to their advice, and discussed major questions with them. Yet once the discussions ended, he acted according to his own judgment. This frustrated Dionysius. The Metropolitan believed that his spiritual influence over Fyodor entitled him to a meaningful voice in affairs of state. Boris regarded him as an advisor whose recommendations could be accepted or ignored. Their disagreement gradually became a political alliance between Dionysius and the hereditary princes. The Metropolitan increasingly sympathized with the Schwiskis and other aristocrats who wanted to reduce Boris's control. From this tension emerged a dangerous plan. Everyone understood that Boris's position depended upon the marriage between Fyodor and Irina. Irina gave her brother constant access to the Tsar and defended his influence within the palace. Without her, Boris could be isolated from the royal household. Dionysius concluded that the surest way to destroy Boris politically was to end the royal marriage. Fyodor and Irina had still produced no surviving child. This allowed their opponents to argue that the future of the dynasty required a new bride. If Irina were removed and sent to a convent, Fyodor might father an heir with another woman. There was a powerful historical precedent. Vasily III had remained childless during his long marriage to Solomonia Saburova. After approximately 20 years, he forced her into a convent and married the much younger Elena Glinskaya. Their union produced Ivan IV. To the conspirators, the parallel was obvious. They could claim that they were not acting from personal hatred, but attempting to preserve the ruling dynasty. The plan promised two results. It would remove Irina, the foundation of Boris's power, and provide Fyodor with a new wife capable of producing a successor. A possible bride had already been chosen, a sister of Prince Fyodor Mstislavsky. The Mstislavskys possessed royal connections and ancient ancestry. Marriage between Fyodor and a Mstislavsky woman would have restored enormous influence to the hereditary nobility and weakened the Godunovs at a single stroke. Metropolitan Dionysius, members of the Schwiski faction, and several noble officials prepared to petition the Tsar. They understood that the proposal could provoke unrest, but they believed the danger was justified. From their perspective, Russia faced the prospect of dynastic extinction. Fyodor had no heir, while Boris appeared to be transforming himself into another autocrat. Removing Irina seemed to offer a solution to both problems. Only Boris and his closest supporters had an interest in preserving the marriage at any cost. The conspiracy, however, never reached Fyodor in the form its organizers intended. Boris maintained a network of informants throughout the court, and loyal servants reported the discussions before the petition could be presented. He now faced a difficult choice. Open executions would make him appear no different from Maluta Skuratov and the Oprichniki. He therefore began with restraint. Boris met Dionysius without displaying anger. He told the Metropolitan that divorce could not be considered. Fyodor and Irina were still young enough to hope for children, and their marriage was affectionate and stable. Boris did not emphasize the existence of the young Dmitry at Uglich. The child remained another possible continuation of Ivan IV's line, but mentioning him would also have drawn attention to a rival center of dynastic loyalty. Dionysius interpreted Boris's calmness as genuine mercy. He apologized and attempted to protect the others by claiming that the proposal had been primarily his own idea. The Metropolitan promised that he would abandon all further discussion of ending the royal marriage. Boris, in return, appeared to forgive him and assured him that the conspirators would not be punished. There was one condition. The woman selected as Fyodor's replacement bride had to disappear from public life. As long as a Mstislavsky princess remained unmarried and available, she could become the center of another campaign to remove Irina. Some accounts claimed that Boris wanted her forced into a convent, yet she later married Prince Vasily Cherkassky, connecting the Mstislavsky, Cherkassky, and Romanov families. That network of marriages would later become politically significant during the upheavals surrounding false Dmitry. Boris had publicly promised forgiveness, but he had no intention of allowing the opposition to survive untouched. Rather than punish them directly for the marriage conspiracy, he searched for another accusation. He turned to a method perfected under Ivan the Terrible, the discovery of an alleged plot against the throne. A servant connected to the Schwiski household was bribed or persuaded to appear at the palace. He claimed that the princes and their allies were preparing to overthrow Fyodor. The accusation gave Boris the justification he needed. Members of the Schwiski family were arrested, along with nobles from the Tatev, Kolichev, Nagoy, and Bekasov houses. Several officials and Moscow merchants associated with the opposition were taken into custody as well. A formal trial followed, but its outcome had already been determined. Noblemen were interrogated, while common merchants were subjected to torture in an effort to force confessions. The testimony failed to confirm the accusations made by the servant. Nevertheless, the defendants were declared guilty. Prince Ivan Petrovich Shuisky was sent into exile near Beluzero. Prince Andrei Ivanovich Shuisky, accused of directing the conspiracy, was sent to Kargopol. Vasily Skopin Shuisky lost his titles and property, but was permitted to remain in Moscow under supervision. Prince Ivan Tatev was sent to Astrakhan. Members of the Kolyshev and Bekasov families were dispatched to Nizhny Novgorod, Vologda, Siberia, and other distant regions. Fyodor Nagoy, several Moscow merchants, and a number of additional prisoners were publicly beheaded in Red Square. Beginning in 1588, the repression continued for approximately a year. It became the first major period of political terror associated with Boris Godunov. Dozens of nobles were arrested, exiled, or stripped of their estates. Property passed into the hands of the crown or men loyal to Boris. The opposition that had once challenged him in the Duma was systematically broken apart. Prince Ivan Mstislavsky was first sent to the Solovetsky Monastery in the White Sea. He was later transferred to the Kirillo-Belozersky Monastery and compelled to become a monk under the name Jonah. Forced monasticism was one of the most effective political weapons of Muscovite Russia. A nobleman who had taken religious vows could no longer marry, command armies, or openly compete for office. With Ivan Mstislavsky removed, his son Fyodor became the formal head of the Boyar Duma. Yet, the younger man exercised authority within a political system already controlled by Boris. Metropolitan Dionysius remained free for the moment. He had no intention of remaining silent while leading princes were humiliated and destroyed. Accompanied by Archbishop Varlam of Krutitsy, he approached Tsar Fyodor directly. Before the ruler, Dionysius denounced Boris as a slanderer and an emerging tyrant. He claimed that the imprisoned nobles were suffering only because they had tried to save Russia from Boris's greed and ambition. Varlam also condemned Fyodor's passivity, warning that divine punishment would fall upon a ruler who allowed injustice to flourish. Their attack was bold, but Fyodor lacked either the will or the ability to defend them. News of the confrontation quickly reached Boris. Both churchmen were arrested, stripped of ecclesiastical rank, and sent into confinement. Dionysius was imprisoned at the Kutin monastery near Novgorod, while Varlam was sent to the Antoniev monastery. Boris then arranged for Job, the Archbishop of Rostov, to become the new metropolitan. Job was loyal, dependable, and far less likely to challenge the government. The removal of Dionysius marked a decisive shift. Boris had not only defeated the hereditary princes, he had also demonstrated that even the head of the Russian Church could be destroyed if he opposed the ruling administration. The fate of the Shuisky leaders was even darker. According to hostile accounts, Prince Andrei and Prince Ivan Shuisky were later killed at their places of exile. Henchmen allegedly strangled or suffocated them on Boris's orders. Whether every detail of these deaths can be established with certainty, their disappearance removed two of the most respected opponents of the Godunov government. By the end of the purge, Boris had transformed the political landscape. The court obeyed him. The leading Shuiskys had been destroyed or scattered. Ivan Mstislavsky had been forced into monastic life. Metropolitan Dionysius had been deposed and replaced by a loyal churchman. Public opponents had been executed, and the Duma was increasingly filled with Godunov relatives and dependents. Boris could now imagine the future more clearly. Fyodor remained childless and physically fragile. When the Tsar died, few organized forces would remain capable of preventing Boris from claiming supreme authority. One possible rival was Semyon Bekbulatovich, the former Tatar prince whom Ivan IV had once theatrically named ruler of Moscow. His title and royal associations could still be used by enemies seeking an alternative candidate. Boris therefore moved against him as well. Semyon was reportedly blinded, deprived of his remaining honors, and removed to a distant place of exile. With each potential competitor neutralized, Boris stood closer to the throne. He still ruled in Fyodor's name, but the distinction between regent and sovereign was becoming increasingly narrow. Vasily Shuisky survived the destruction of his family. After spending approximately 2 years in exile, he was permitted to return to Moscow, and some of his confiscated property was restored. Boris may have believed that a weakened and grateful Shuisky was less dangerous than a martyred enemy. Vasily, however, would neither forget nor forgive what had happened to his relatives. For the moment, resistance had been silenced. While Boris governed, Tsar Fyodor continued living in a world shaped more by religion than politics. Whenever the ceremonies of monarchy exhausted him, he withdrew into devotional life. He dressed as a humble pilgrim and traveled from monastery to monastery, though even his acts of simplicity were protected by armed guards and carefully organized in advance. He frequently visited the Trinity Monastery of St. Sergius and other sacred sites with Tsaritsa Irina. These journeys allowed Fyodor to escape the pressures of court while strengthening his image as a holy and peaceful ruler. Boris supervised the arrangements. He understood the political value of contrasting Fyodor with Ivan the Terrible. Where Ivan had inspired fear, Fyodor would inspire reverence. Where the father had appeared as a punishing monarch, the son would be presented as a Christian sovereign devoted to prayer and mercy. A foreign visitor left a detailed description of Fyodor's daily routine. The Tsar commonly awoke at approximately 4 in the morning. His chamber was filled with icons, and candles burned there throughout the night. He waited for his confessor, who entered carrying a cross, holy water, prayers, and an icon connected with the saint commemorated that day. Fyodor bowed repeatedly, prayed aloud, and then visited Irina's apartments. The royal couple slept in separate rooms but attended the morning service together. After prayer, they received visitors, clergy, and monks in the great chamber. Later in the morning, Fyodor attended the Divine Liturgy. He ate before noon and then usually slept for several hours. In the evening, he returned to church for Vespers. Between services and dinner, he spent time with Irina, listened to songs, watched court entertainers, or observed craftsmen working on jewelry, clothing, icons, and precious objects. Before sleeping, he prayed again with his confessor and received a final blessing. His weekly routine included visits to monasteries around Moscow. On feast days or periods without official obligations, he sometimes attended hunts or public spectacles. Petitioners occasionally attempted to approach him at the entrance to the palace. Fyodor usually avoided hearing their disputes and directed them toward Boris. This single habit revealed the political order of the reign. Subjects approached the Tsar, but practical authority belonged to Godunov. Russian chroniclers emphasized Fyodor's piety, but were less eager to discuss his taste for violent entertainment. Despite his gentle reputation, he reportedly enjoyed watching fistfights, bear baiting, and other bloody spectacles common at the time. Such amusements did not make him an active or cruel ruler. They showed only that religious devotion and fascination with violence could exist side by side within the culture of the Muscovite court. Boris benefited from Fyodor's withdrawal. Every hour the Tsar spent in prayer, pilgrimage, sleep, or entertainment left the business of government in other hands. At the same time, Boris carefully elevated his sister's reputation. Donations to the poor, assistance to victims of fire, and gifts to churches were often distributed publicly in the name of Tsaritsa Irina. This allowed Irina to appear as the compassionate mother of the nation. It also strengthened the Godunov family's connection to charitable government and public mercy. Fyodor's name was sometimes given less emphasis. Boris wanted the population to associate effective rule not only with the Tsar, but with Irina and himself. The arrangement was subtle. Fyodor remained the sacred monarch. Irina became the benevolent Tsaritsa. Boris handled the state. With the opposition broken, the church brought under control, and his family placed throughout the government, Boris was no longer merely preparing to exercise power. He was preparing Russia to accept him as its future ruler. The death of Stephen Bathory on December 12, 1586, altered the political balance of Eastern Europe. Bathory had been one of the most formidable rulers of his generation, a soldier king whose campaigns had helped bring Ivan the Terrible's long struggle for Livonia to a humiliating conclusion. His disappearance now created a rare opening, and Boris Godunov intended to exploit it. For Boris, the vacant throne of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth offered far more than a diplomatic opportunity. If Tsar Fyodor could be elected king, Russia might peacefully obtain what Ivan IV had failed to secure through 25 years of warfare: access to Livonia, the Baltic coastline, and the commercial routes connecting northern Europe with the interior of Russia. The economic value of such a union was immense. Russia possessed forests, grain, wax, furs, metals, and other resources desired in European markets, yet its access to western sea routes remained narrow and insecure. Control of Baltic ports would increase trade, strengthen state revenue, and raise Moscow's standing among European powers. The strategic idea anticipated the ambitions of later Russian rulers. More than a century afterward, Peter the Great would also fight for access to the Baltic and establish a new capital facing Europe. Boris hoped to achieve a similar transformation through dynastic election rather than prolonged conquest. The personal rewards were equally attractive. A political union connecting Russia, Poland, and Lithuania would place Boris at the center of one of the largest power systems in Europe. Fyodor might possess the crowns, but Boris would almost certainly direct the government behind them. An envoy named Elizar Zhevsky was quickly sent toward Vilnius to present Fyodor as a candidate for the vacant throne. He soon discovered, however, that the real political struggle had shifted to Warsaw, where the nobility of the Commonwealth had assembled to choose Bathory's successor. Among the strongest candidates was Sigismund Vasa, the son of King John III of Sweden. His dynastic background, Catholic faith, and connections with the Polish aristocracy gave him considerable support. The political system Boris encountered differed fundamentally from that of Muscovite Russia. Fyodor had inherited his throne as an autocrat. His authority, at least in theory, was absolute and sanctioned by hereditary right. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth operated through an elective monarchy. Its nobles guarded extensive privileges, and a king could not simply impose his will upon them. He had to negotiate, promise concessions, accept legal limitations, and preserve the political liberties of the aristocracy. Boris seems to have regarded these restrictions as inconvenient but manageable. He believed that wealth, diplomacy, and promises of military protection could persuade the electors. A more impressive Russian embassy was therefore sent to Warsaw. It included Boris's relative Stepan Vasilievich Godunov, Prince Fyodor Troyekurovich, and the experienced official Vasily Shelkalov. The envoys carried dozens of copies of a proposal describing how the new union might function. In essence, Fyodor would assume authority over a vast political association linking Russia with Poland and Lithuania. The document promised security against the Crimean Tatars and the Ottoman Empire. It offered expanded commerce with Western Europe and the markets of Asia. It also implied that the resources and military strength of Russia would protect the Commonwealth from invasion. Behind the language of partnership, however, stood an unmistakable assumption: Moscow would become the dominant power. Russia expected to obtain Livonia and secure the Baltic territories for which Ivan IV had fought. Polish and Lithuanian lands would become closely integrated with the Muscovite state, while Boris and his administration would gain decisive influence over trade and foreign policy. The proposal also contained an unusual succession arrangement. Neither a future child of Fyodor nor the young Dmitry Ivanovich at Uglich was automatically guaranteed the combined throne. The omission was intended to satisfy the elective traditions of the Commonwealth, but it also showed how far Boris was prepared to manipulate the succession in pursuit of the union. Fyodor himself could easily be persuaded by the grandeur of the idea. The possibility of ruling three great realms appealed to the ceremonial dignity of monarchy, even though he exercised little practical authority in Russia and would have faced formal constitutional limitations in Poland-Lithuania. The first serious obstacle was religion. The Polish nobility expected concessions to the Catholic world and demanded that Russia accept ecclesiastical union with Rome before Fyodor's candidacy could be seriously considered. For the Orthodox state of Moscow, submission to papal authority was politically and spiritually explosive. Boris may have considered religion negotiable within the language of diplomacy, but the issue could not be treated lightly by the Russian clergy or population. Moscow increasingly regarded itself as the principal defender of orthodoxy after the fall of Constantinople. The Polish and Lithuanian electors were also deeply suspicious. Their countries had fought Muscovy repeatedly, and they understood that Boris, rather than Fyodor, directed Russian policy. They had no desire to exchange one elected king for a ruler who might eventually impose Muscovite autocracy upon them. The image of Fyodor as a weak monarch did not reassure them, because they knew that Boris stood behind him. The proposal was therefore rejected. The Russian delegation hoped to return with more flexible terms, but events moved faster than Boris anticipated. Sigismund Vasa secured the necessary support and was crowned as Sigismund III on December 16, 1587. Boris's attempt to extend Russian influence through the Polish election had failed. Yet the accession of Sigismund created new tensions of its own. Sigismund was not only king of the Commonwealth, he was also connected to the Swedish royal dynasty, and his ambitions would eventually pull Poland, Lithuania, Sweden, and Russia into a broader struggle for influence around the Baltic. Relations between Moscow and Stockholm were already deteriorating. An earlier agreement between Ivan IV and Sweden had expired in 1586. King John III did not provide Moscow with the concessions Boris expected, particularly regarding the northwestern lands lost during the final years of Ivan's reign. Boris believed that Russia should recover territories in Karelia and the far north, while the Swedish crown regarded its recent gains as permanent. In 1589, Swedish forces advanced into Karelia and occupied lands around Lakes Ladoga and Onega. The incursion threatened Russian settlements and challenged Moscow's remaining access toward the Baltic. Fyodor's government demanded the return of the occupied territory and added a wider claim to Estonia. If Sweden refused, Russia threatened war. The aggressive policy came largely from Boris. Until that moment, his foreign policy had been marked by caution. He preferred truces, negotiations, and carefully managed compromises. He lacked the personal fascination with warfare that had consumed Ivan IV and did not seek military glory for its own sake. Yet caution could be mistaken for weakness. Boris wanted both Russian nobles and foreign rulers to understand that his desire for peace did not arise from fear. There were moments he believed when war became necessary to protect the honor and strategic interests of the state. Preparations began on an enormous scale. Chronicles claimed that the Russian host included 300,000 soldiers and 300 cannon. As with many military figures from the period, the total was almost certainly exaggerated. Even so, the campaign represented a major mobilization. Boris also understood the importance of royal symbolism. Fyodor could not remain hidden in the palace while the state marched to war. The army needed to see its anointed ruler at the head of the regiments. The Tsar was therefore persuaded to appear on horseback. Fyodor had little interest in military display and mounted his warhorse reluctantly. Nevertheless, he rode from Moscow toward Novgorod before the assembled troops. Tsaritsa Irina accompanied the royal procession, reinforcing the public image of a united dynasty leading Russia into battle. The true military command rested with more capable men. Prince Fyodor Mstislavsky held the principal command, while the experienced Dmitry Kvorostinin directed forces at the rear and played a major operational role. Boris Godunov and Fyodor Nikitich Romanov occupied senior positions in the command structure, though Boris remained more political organizer than battlefield general. The campaign opened from Novgorod on January 18, 1590. Russian armies moved along several routes toward Karelia, Swedish Estonia, and the fortress of Narva. Winter conditions were severe. Roads were frozen, supplies were difficult to move, and soldiers advanced through bitter cold. Yet the low temperatures also hardened the ground, allowing heavy equipment and artillery to travel across areas that would have been almost impassable in warmer weather. The first significant victory came on January 27th, when Kvorostinin defeated a Swedish force commanded by Gustav Barnér. Russian accounts placed the Swedish army at around 20,000 men, though the actual figure may have been smaller. The victory opened the way toward the principal fortresses of the region. Russian troops soon reached Narva and subjected its defenses to bombardment. According to the triumphant Muscovite narrative, the fortress fell early in February, while other Russian forces swept through parts of Estonia and pressed deeper into territory controlled by Sweden. The campaign spread across the Gulf of Finland region. Raiding forces and regiments moved through the countryside, seized settlements, and threatened communications extending towards southern Finland. Some accounts described Russian detachments advancing as far as the region of Obo, later known as Turku. Whether permanent occupation was ever realistic mattered less than the message. Sweden could no longer assume that Russia was too exhausted to retaliate. By late February, negotiations began. Moscow claimed that Sweden had accepted defeat and agreed to restore Karelia, Narva, and coastal territories near the Gulf of Finland. The actual conflict and the eventual settlement would prove more complicated and continue beyond this opening campaign, but Boris immediately presented the operation as a decisive success. For the first time in years, Russia had reversed part of the humiliation suffered at the end of Ivan's reign. Fyodor did not remain long near the military front. Once the principal demonstrations of royal leadership were complete, he returned to Irina and eventually traveled back toward Moscow. The victory was celebrated as an achievement that Ivan IV had failed to secure despite decades of war. The comparison was politically valuable. Fyodor's peaceful and pious reign could now claim a military triumph over Sweden without appearing to revive his father's destructive ambitions. Church leaders and officials met the royal party outside the capital. Metropolitan Job delivered an elaborate speech praising the Tsar. He compared Fyodor with Constantine the Great, the Roman emperor associated with the triumph of Christianity, and with Vladimir of Kiev, remembered as the ruler who brought the Christian faith to Rus. Job proclaimed that the Tsar had restored ancient Slavic lands and defended both the church and the fatherland. The speech transformed a political and military campaign into a sacred act of national recovery. The conflict with Sweden also strengthened Russia's position in negotiations with Poland-Lithuania. On January 1, 1591, Fyodor summoned churchmen and nobles to a council. A new peace proposal was prepared and sent to Warsaw. Sigismund accepted a long truce, traditionally described as extending for approximately 20 years. For the moment, Moscow avoided a simultaneous struggle against both Sweden and the Commonwealth. Russia gained breathing space on its western frontier, while Boris concentrated on internal government and expansion elsewhere. By 1591, his prestige had reached its height. Inside Russia, he was no longer viewed merely as the Tsar's brother-in-law. Foreign ambassadors, provincial officials, military commanders, merchants, and ordinary subjects understood that he was the effective ruler of the country. Reports from distant towns and frontier settlements repeated the same conclusion. Boris Fyodorovich Godunov governed the land. Decisions were made through him, rewards came from him, and policies succeeded because he directed them. The extent of the admiration described by later chroniclers was probably idealized, but there is little doubt that Boris enjoyed genuine popularity. He had restored stability, improved security, supported commerce, expanded settlement, and avoided the endless bloodshed associated with Ivan IV. Nobles respected his ability even when they hated his origins. Merchants valued peace and safer roads. Provincial communities benefited from stronger administration. Many peasants and poorer residents knew him through donations, famine relief, and public charity. Boris responded to this acclaim not with restraint, but with greater ambition. Every success appeared to confirm that he alone possessed the ability to guide Russia. The more indispensable he became, the more natural it seemed that the authority he exercised should one day be made permanent. His political rise was soon reinforced by a profound transformation within the Russian Church. In 1586, Patriarch Joachim of Antioch arrived in Moscow seeking financial assistance. The ancient Eastern Patriarchates lived under Ottoman domination and frequently depended upon donations from Orthodox rulers and wealthy communities abroad. During Joachim's visit, Fyodor raised the possibility that Moscow should possess a patriarch of its own. The suggestion marked a major development in Russian religious history. Since the conversion of Rus under Vladimir in 988, the senior churchman in the Russian lands had carried the title of Metropolitan and had historically existed under the authority of Constantinople. For more than a century, however, Moscow had increasingly acted independently. Russian bishops had chosen and ordained their own metropolitan without meaningful intervention from Constantinople for decades. In practical terms, the Russian Church was already self-governing, yet titles carried enormous symbolic power. A patriarchate would place Moscow among the principal centers of Orthodox Christianity. It would confirm that Russia was no longer a distant province of the Byzantine religious world, but one of its leading powers. Joachim promised to present the proposal to the other Eastern patriarchs. When he departed, he carried thousands of gold ducats and valuable gifts from the Russian court. The generosity was presented as Christian charity, but it also created a strong expectation that he would support Moscow's request. At first, many Russians had seen little need for a change in title. The Metropolitan already exercised authority over the church, and elevation to patriarch would not greatly alter his daily responsibilities. Boris viewed the matter differently. A Russian patriarchate would strengthen the international prestige of Moscow and place the national church more firmly under a hierarchy created during his administration. It would also serve his personal future. If Fyodor died without a son, Boris would face questions about his lack of royal blood. Coronation by a Russian patriarch could provide powerful religious legitimacy to a new dynasty. The sacred anointing of an independent patriarch would help present Boris not as a usurper, but as a ruler chosen and blessed by God. The Eastern patriarchs also possessed reasons to cooperate. Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem all existed under Muslim Ottoman rule. Their churches suffered from taxation, political interference, and chronic financial difficulties. Russia, by contrast, was wealthy, independent, and orthodox. Its treasury could support monasteries, clergy, schools, and holy sites throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Some churchmen may also have hoped that a powerful Russian state might one day confront the Ottoman Empire and liberate Orthodox Christians from Muslim rule. The negotiations advanced further in June 1588, when Patriarch Jeremiah II of Constantinople arrived in Moscow. His visit caused extraordinary excitement. Constantinople remained the first city of the Orthodox world, despite having fallen to the Ottomans in 1453. Its patriarch held a place of honor among the Eastern churches and carried the memory of the Byzantine Empire. Jeremiah entered Moscow, accompanied by Metropolitan Hierotheos of Monemvasia and Archbishop Arsenios, together with clergy, servants, and attendants. The visitors were received in the Golden Chamber of the Kremlin. Fyodor greeted them with elaborate respect and seated them near the royal throne. They presented sacred gifts, including an icon depicting scenes from the Passion of Christ, relics associated with the early Christian emperors, and objects believed to contain the blood or remains of saints. Such gifts strengthened the spiritual atmosphere of the meeting, but money and politics were never far beneath the surface. Fyodor soon asked Boris to conduct a private conversation with Jeremiah. The patriarch and the effective ruler of Russia withdrew into an adjoining chamber. There, Jeremiah described the misfortunes of his church. He had served as patriarch for years before enemies accused him before the Ottoman authorities. The charges led to his removal and exile on Rhodes. Despite earlier Ottoman promises not to interfere in internal church affairs, another bishop, Theoleptos, was installed in his place. Several years later, political circumstances changed. Theoleptos fell from favor, and Jeremiah was restored. During the period of turmoil, the Patriarchate had been weakened financially and spiritually. Churches had lost property, clergy struggled to support themselves, and the Christian institutions of Constantinople survived under constant political pressure. The great cathedral of Hagia Sophia had long since become an imperial mosque, an enduring symbol of the disappearance of Byzantine power. Boris understood immediately that Jeremiah needed Russian assistance. The Patriarch's difficulties placed him in a position similar to that of Joachim of Antioch. Moscow possessed the wealth Jeremiah required. Jeremiah possessed the authority Boris desired. Negotiations continued behind the ceremonies of hospitality. At one point, the Russians may have considered asking Jeremiah to remain permanently in Moscow as patriarch. Such an arrangement would have given the city enormous prestige, but might also have placed the Russian church under a foreign senior prelate. The discussions eventually moved toward a more acceptable solution. Jeremiah agreed to establish a patriarchate in Moscow and consecrate the candidate chosen by the Russian ruler. That candidate had already been decided. Metropolitan Job owed his advancement to Boris and had repeatedly supported the government. He praised Fyodor's victories, defended the policies of the court, and showed no inclination to challenge Godunov's authority. Tradition required the appearance of a formal ecclesiastical selection. 3 candidates were therefore presented: Job of Moscow, Varlam of Rostov, and Alexander of Novgorod. The process was described as a legitimate choice by the Council of Bishops, but no one seriously doubted the intended result. The name placed before Fyodor was Job. The confirmation ceremony was appointed for January 23, 1589. After the morning service, Job appeared in the Cathedral of the Assumption wearing the full vestments of a metropolitan. Fyodor, Jeremiah, senior bishops, boyars, and representatives of the court attended. At the conclusion of the liturgy, Job emerged from the sanctuary and approached the raised platform. He carried a candle and a written expression of gratitude. A churchman then proclaimed that the Orthodox sovereign, the ecumenical patriarch, and the sacred council had elevated him to the highest ecclesiastical throne of Moscow, Vladimir, and all Russia. Job answered with ritual humility. He described himself as an unworthy and sinful servant, but declared that he would accept the office if it were truly the will of the Tsar, Patriarch Jeremiah, and the assembled church. He bowed before the clergy and the people, promising to guard the Christian community entrusted to him. The words were humble, but the political meaning was enormous. For the first time, Russia possessed its own patriarch. Moscow could now present itself as an independent center of the Orthodox world. The Russian Church no longer appeared merely as a distant metropolitan province. It stood beside the ancient patriarchates of the East. Fyodor received the glory of having established the new institution. Job received the highest title in the Russian Church. Boris Godunov received something even more valuable. He had created a loyal patriarchate capable of blessing his government, strengthening Moscow's international prestige, and one day sanctifying his own path to the throne. Job's formal enthronement as patriarch took place on January 26, 1589. The ceremony began during the Divine Liturgy in the Cathedral of the Assumption, where Job stood before Patriarch Jeremiah of Constantinople. Jeremiah placed his hand upon the Russian metropolitan, recited the consecrating prayers, blessed him, and set the patriarchal crown upon his head. The 2 church leaders then celebrated the remainder of the liturgy together, publicly confirming that Moscow had entered the highest order of the Orthodox hierarchy. Once the service had ended, Tsar Fyodor personally presented Job with the visible symbols of his new office. Around his neck, he placed a richly decorated cross believed to contain a fragment of the true cross. Job was dressed in a green velvet mantle adorned with long bands of pearls and received a white monastic cowl embroidered with a cross. Fyodor then handed him the ancient pastoral staff associated with Metropolitan Peter of Moscow, one of the most revered figures in the history of the Russian Church. The Tsar proclaimed Job the senior bishop of the Russian lands, the father of bishops, and patriarch of the vast northern realm. His elevation, Fyodor declared, had been accomplished by the will of God and the authority of the sovereign. Job responded by blessing the Tsar, the clergy, and the assembled court. The religious celebrations then moved beyond the walls of the cathedral. Following an old ceremonial tradition, Job mounted a donkey and was led in procession around the Kremlin. Bishops and state officials walked beside him while he raised a cross, sprinkled holy water upon the fortifications, and prayed for the protection of Moscow. The ritual presented the Kremlin not merely as a political fortress, but as a sacred city under divine protection. Later that day, Jeremiah and Job attended a ceremonial banquet hosted by the Tsar. Despite the grandeur of the occasion, an important difficulty remained. Jeremiah had authorized the creation of another patriarchal throne without first receiving the formal agreement of the other senior Orthodox patriarchs. To defend the decision, Moscow produced an official charter that placed the elevation of the Russian Church within a much larger interpretation of Christian history. The document drew upon the developing idea of Moscow as the Third Rome. According to this vision, ancient Rome had fallen from true belief through doctrinal corruption and separation from orthodoxy. Constantinople, the Second Rome, had later fallen under Ottoman rule. Moscow therefore remained the principal independent center of the Orthodox Christian world. The papacy was portrayed as a false spiritual authority, that had abandoned the original faith. Constantinople remained first in dignity among the Orthodox sees, followed by Alexandria. Moscow's representatives attempted to place the new Russian Patriarchate in third position, above Antioch and Jerusalem. The argument rested partly upon political reality. Russia was enormous, independent, militarily powerful, and financially capable of supporting the Eastern churches. Antioch and Jerusalem, by comparison, governed smaller Christian communities under Ottoman domination and survived in considerable poverty. Boris expected the importance of the Russian state to determine the rank of its church. The antiquity of the older patriarchates, however, could not be dismissed so easily. When the Eastern patriarchs later considered the agreement, they accepted the existence of the Moscow Patriarchate but rejected its claim to third place. Moscow was placed fifth, after Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Even in fifth position, the result represented an extraordinary victory. The Russian Church had gained formal recognition as an independent patriarchate, and Moscow had been admitted into the highest structure of Orthodox Christianity. Job immediately began reorganizing the hierarchy beneath him. 4 major sees were elevated to metropolitan rank: Novgorod, Kazan, Rostov, and Krutitsy near Moscow. Several other dioceses received archbishops, including Vologda, Suzdal, Nizhny Novgorod, Smolensk, Ryazan, and Tver. Additional bishoprics were established or confirmed in cities such as Pskov, Kolomna, Dmitrov, Ustyug, Belozero, and other regional centers. The reforms expanded the administrative reach of the church and reflected the growing territory of the Russian state. Jeremiah and his companions remained in Russia until the spring of 1589. They visited monasteries, churches, and sacred sites while being treated as honored guests of the court. When they finally departed in May, they carried generous financial gifts, traditionally estimated at several thousand gold ducats, as well as a copy of the charter establishing the Russian Patriarchate. The document was to be presented to the remaining Eastern patriarchs for final approval. Boris had achieved far more than an ecclesiastical reform. He had created an institution whose leader owed his position directly to the Godunov administration. Job had risen with Boris's support and was unlikely to forget the source of his elevation. This loyalty might one day become essential. Boris could not depend forever upon Irina's influence over her husband, nor could he be certain that the boyars, military commanders, or provincial nobility would support him after Fyodor's death. The Patriarch, however, could provide something that no ordinary political faction could offer: sacred legitimacy. No Russian ruler outside the ancient dynasty had yet been crowned and anointed by a native patriarch. Boris appears to have understood that the new institution could eventually bless the creation of an entirely new ruling house. The Patriarchate strengthened Russia. It also prepared a path toward the throne. Yet one obstacle remained more dangerous than all the others. Tsarevich Dmitry Ivanovich was still alive. Boris already possessed nearly every element of sovereignty. He controlled the administration, commanded the loyalty of the court, dominated foreign policy, and exercised enormous influence over the church. Only the crown itself remained on Fyodor's head. Had Boris been content to govern as regent, his position was almost unassailable. But Fyodor's health was uncertain, and the Tsar had produced no surviving child. If Fyodor died before Irina bore an heir, the succession would not necessarily pass to Boris. At Uglich lived Dmitry, the youngest son of Ivan the Terrible. The child was being raised under the supervision of his mother, Maria Nagaya, and her relatives. Their residence was comfortable and maintained with the dignity expected for members of the ruling family, but it remained a form of exile. The Nagoys had not forgotten who had removed them from Moscow. They blamed Boris for isolating Dmitry from the capital and believed that the Godunov family had used Irina's marriage to seize control of the state. Their resentment carried a serious threat. If Fyodor died, Dmitry could become Tsar. Because he was still a child, his mother and maternal relatives would probably govern as regents. The Nagoy family would return from Uglich not as exiles, but as masters of the Kremlin. Boris had every reason to fear what would follow. Irina might be forced into a convent, following the usual method of removing royal widows and politically dangerous women. Boris himself could be imprisoned, stripped of his property, exiled, or executed. He had inflicted such punishments upon his own enemies and understood perfectly how quickly power could reverse direction. The prisons and distant monasteries to which he had sent his rivals might one day receive him. The throne therefore represented more than ambition. To Boris, supreme authority may also have appeared as the only guarantee of survival. Later chroniclers hostile to the Godunov dynasty described his desire for the crown as an obsession that gradually consumed his judgment. In their accounts, he ceased to view power merely as a means of governing Russia and began to imagine it as a place beyond the reach of enemies, vengeance, and humiliation. These writers also accused him of consulting astrologers, magicians, and fortune-tellers. According to one frequently repeated story, Boris summoned such men secretly at night and demanded that they reveal his future. They flattered him by declaring that a crown awaited him, but then hesitated before revealing how long he would possess it. When pressed, they allegedly predicted that he would reign for only 7 years. Boris was said to have answered that even 7 days would be enough, provided he could wear the crown. The story cannot be verified and may have been created after his fall to portray his ambition as both sinful and doomed. Yet it survived because it captured how later generations understood him, as a ruler who possessed almost everything but was tormented by the one title still denied to him. Boris had filled the Duma, the court, and the central offices with relatives, allies, and dependents. He trusted the loyalty of Patriarch Job and believed that his successful government had earned the respect of the country. For the first time since the rise of the dynasty descended from Rurik, Russia faced the possibility that the direct ruling line might end. Boris believed that if the scepter fell from the hands of the final legitimate ruler, it should pass to the man who had already governed the state for years. Dmitry alone stood between that belief and reality. The prince was still a child, but dynastic legitimacy did not depend upon age or political ability. His blood gave him a stronger hereditary claim than any office, fortune, or achievement could give Boris. Later, anti-Godunov narratives therefore accused Boris of deciding that Dmitry had to die. The precise truth remains deeply disputed. Much of the surviving narrative was written after Boris had become politically discredited, during a period when several competing groups benefited from presenting him as the murderer of Ivan the Terrible's last son. Nevertheless, even before Dmitry's death, the government clearly attempted to weaken his public status. The first strategy was to question his legitimacy. Dmitry had been born to Ivan IV's final wife, Maria Nagaya. Depending upon how Ivan's marriages were counted, she was often described as his 6th or 7th wife. Orthodox canon law normally recognized far fewer marriages, creating uncertainty about the validity of the union. Boris's supporters began emphasizing this problem. They argued that because the church should never have recognized the marriage, Dmitry could not be treated as a fully legitimate heir. His name was reportedly excluded from certain public prayers and ceremonies, reducing the visible recognition normally given to a prince of the ruling house. The argument, however, was not decisive. Ivan's marriage to Maria had been blessed or at least tolerated by the Russian church. The court had recognized Dmitry as the Tsar's son, and many Russians continued to regard him as a genuine member of the dynasty. A second campaign attacked his character. Stories spread through Moscow claiming that the young prince had inherited Ivan IV's cruelty. Though only 8 or 9 years old, he was described as violent, unstable, and fascinated by suffering. Some rumors accused him of tormenting animals and watching slaughter with unnatural pleasure. Others portrayed him as threatening servants, playmates, and officials. The most theatrical story concerned a winter game at Uglish. According to this tale, Dmitry ordered that figures be shaped from snow and named after important members of the government. One of them represented Boris Godunov. The boy then supposedly attacked the figures with a wooden sword. When he reached the one bearing Boris's name, he cut off its head, arms, and legs while declaring that he would do the same when he became Tsar. The story served an obvious political purpose. It transformed a child into a future tyrant and suggested that Boris's fears were not merely selfish. If Dmitry inherited the throne the rumor implied, Russia might experience a second reign of Ivan the Terrible. Those who knew the household at Uglich reportedly offered a different image. They described Dmitry as intelligent, confident, and unusually forceful for his age. Such qualities could be interpreted as signs of leadership rather than cruelty. Yet few people were willing to defend him publicly. Open praise for Dmitry might be treated as opposition to the government or support for a rival claimant. Later, chronicles went further and accused Boris of attempting to poison the prince. The nurse Vasilisa Volokova and her son Osip were said to have accepted money and agreed to place poison in Dmitry's food or drink. According to the story, the poison repeatedly failed to harm him. Some versions claimed that Vasilisa lost her nerve and weakened the dose. Others interpreted the failure as evidence of divine protection surrounding the child. No reliable evidence proves that such an attempt occurred. The tale formed part of the larger body of accusations constructed around Dmitry's eventual death. The same accounts asserted that Boris then approached two former officials connected with the Oprichnina, Vladimir Zagryazhsky and Nikifor Chepchugov. They were supposedly indebted to him and accustomed to carrying out dangerous orders. Even these hardened men, the story continued, refused to murder a child of the royal family. They promised to remain silent, but were later harassed because they had rejected the command. Whether these episodes were historical or later inventions, they reveal the atmosphere surrounding the succession. Dmitry was no ordinary provincial child. His continued existence affected every calculation at the Kremlin. To the Nagoy family, he represented restoration and revenge. To the hereditary nobility, he offered a possible alternative to Godunov. To many Russians, he remained the final young branch of the old dynasty. And to Boris, he represented a future in which everything already gained, wealth, authority, security, and perhaps life itself, could disappear in a single moment. The struggle for the Russian throne had not yet become open, but its most dangerous chapter was approaching. According to the later narrative accusing Boris Godunov of organizing Dmitry's death, the search for an assassin eventually led to Andrei Kleshnin, a palace official closely connected to Boris. Kleshnin was an ambitious courtier who understood that success depended upon usefulness. Hoping to strengthen his position, he allegedly offered to find men capable of carrying out an order that others had rejected. The central figure he selected was Mikhail Bityagovsky, a government official already feared for his violence and harsh temperament. Hostile chroniclers portray him as physically imposing, ruthless, and willing to perform almost any service in return for wealth and protection. Boris was said to have promised him gold, future rewards, and security if suspicion fell upon him. Bityagovsky accepted the assignment and traveled to Uglich under the legitimate appearance of supervising administrative and financial affairs within the household of the widowed Tsaritsa Maria Nagaya. The use of an official mission gave him access to the prince's residence without immediately attracting attention. Bityagovsky was accompanied by his son Danila and his nephew Nikita Kachalov. Both men were later described as violent dependents accustomed to obeying him. Osip Volokov, the son of Dmitry's nurse Vasilisa, was already present in Uglich and was also accused of joining the supposed conspiracy. Their instructions, according to this version of events, were simple. Observe the prince constantly and act when he could be separated from his mother and attendants. They expected the opportunity to come quickly. Maria Nagaya had a large household to supervise, and the assassins assumed that domestic responsibilities would eventually distract her. Instead, they discovered that she rarely allowed Dmitry out of her sight. The young prince was usually accompanied either by his mother or by trusted women of the household. Maria reportedly distrusted Vasilisa Volokova and also remained suspicious of some servants working in the kitchens and private rooms. Only when attending church did she regularly separate from her son, and even then his movements were closely watched. Days passed without a suitable opportunity. The men accused of planning the attack could not isolate the prince. The hostile account therefore claims that they abandoned secrecy and decided to kill him in the open. Dmitry died at Uglich on May 15, 1591. The dramatic assassination narrative places the event in the early evening, shortly before dinner. Maria had returned from church and was occupied inside the residence. Her brothers were absent, while servants prepared the table. Vasilisa Volokova reportedly suggested that Dmitri go outside and play while the meal was being completed. Maria at first considered accompanying him but remained inside. A cook attempted to delay the child, but the nurse took him through the vestibule and onto the courtyard or balcony area. There, according to the accusation, Osip Volokov, Danila Bityagovsky, and Nikita Kachalov were waiting. Osip approached Dmitri while concealing a knife. He took the child's hand and attempted to distract him by commenting upon a necklace around his neck. Dmitri looked up and replied that the necklace was not new. The later story claims that Osip then drew the knife and struck the prince across the throat. The wound was incomplete, and, horrified by what he had done, he dropped the weapon and fled. Dmitri fell. His nurse threw herself over him and screamed for help. Danila Bityagovsky and Kachalov allegedly pulled her away, beat her, and completed the murder. They stabbed the prince repeatedly and cut deeply into his neck before leaving his body near the steps. Maria heard the cries and rushed outside. She found her son covered in blood and the nurse lying nearby. The sight threw her into uncontrollable grief. Other members of the household emerged, while servants pointed toward men attempting to escape through the courtyard. This highly detailed scene became central to the later charge that Dmitri had been deliberately murdered. Yet much of it derives from narratives written after the event, when the boy's death had become one of the most politically explosive questions in Russia. What is certain is that an alarm bell began ringing through Uglich. Residents initially assumed that a fire had broken out. Crowds hurried toward the sound and entered the prince's residence, where they found Dmitri dead. Confusion quickly became fury. Maria Nagaya and members of her household accused Bityagovsky and his associates of murder. The prince's death was immediately interpreted not as a private accident, but as an attack upon the ruling dynasty. The men identified as responsible attempted to hide or escape. Once the crowd surrounded the residence, their chances of survival disappeared. That explanation, which later became the official conclusion of the investigation, only increased the anger of the crowd. People shouted that the child had been murdered. Stones were thrown, and Bityagovsky fled toward the quarters of a servant named Danila Tretyakov. The mob followed. Both men were dragged out and beaten to death. Danila Bityagovsky and Nikita Kachalov were discovered in an outbuilding and killed by the crowd. Osip Volokov attempted to take refuge inside another residence, but he too was seized. He was dragged toward the church where Dmitri's body had been taken and was killed in the presence of the prince's grieving mother. Several additional people suspected of involvement were also attacked. Among those killed was a female servant connected to Bityagovsky's household who appears to have had no meaningful role in the event. The violence was uncontrolled. Suspicion became sufficient evidence, and the population of Uglich acted as judge and executioner before any formal inquiry could begin. Vasilisa Volokova survived. Later hostile accounts suggested that the accused men had publicly named Boris as the true organizer while pleading for their lives. Whether such statements were actually made cannot be established with certainty. By the end of the disturbance, the prince was dead, several government officials had been lynched, and Uglich had entered open rebellion against the authority represented by Moscow. Local officials prepared a report and sent messengers toward the capital. The anti-Godunov tradition claims that Boris had already placed trusted men along the road from Uglich. Travelers were questioned and searched, and the couriers carrying the first report were detained. According to this accusation, the original message was confiscated and replaced with a new account dictated in Moscow. The revised version blamed Dmitri's death upon an accidental wound suffered during an epileptic seizure. Responsibility was shifted toward the Nogoy family, who were accused of negligence for allowing the prince to handle a sharp object. It also claimed that Maria and her brothers had falsely accused innocent state officials and incited the population to kill them. Boris then presented the news to Fyodor. Later, chroniclers described him entering the Tsar's presence with every appearance of grief. He wept over the death of Fyodor's younger brother and joined the Tsar in mourning. Fyodor reportedly accepted the news with religious resignation, declaring that the will of God must be obeyed. The official explanation, however, could not simply be announced without investigation. too many people in Uglich had witnessed the aftermath, and the violent deaths of state officials demanded a legal response. A commission was therefore appointed and sent to the city. Its composition was carefully chosen. Andrei Kleshnin represented the administration and was closely associated with Boris. His presence immediately created suspicion among those who believed the government had something to conceal. To lend the inquiry greater credibility, Prince Vasily Ivanovich Shuisky was placed at its head. Shuisky belonged to one of Russia's most respected princely families and had himself suffered under Godunov's political domination. His appointment suggested that the investigation would not be conducted solely by Boris's allies. The commission also included the official Elizar Viluzgin and Metropolitan Gelisy of Krutitsy. They reached Uglich on May 19th, 4 days after Dmitri's death. Their first destination was the Cathedral of the Transfiguration, where the prince's body had been placed before burial. There they viewed the corpse and the knife associated with the fatal wound. Maria Nagaya, her relatives, and many residents of the city continued to mourn around the coffin. Later narratives describe Shuisky examining the body closely, while Kleshnin became visibly shaken by the sight of the dead child. He supposedly stood speechless, staring at Dmitri's blood-stained clothing and the deep injury across his throat. Such descriptions were intended to show that the wound could not possibly have been accidental, and that even one of the alleged conspirators recognized the horror of what had occurred. The available evidence, however, remains less certain than these dramatic accounts suggest. The original investigative documents survive only within a political context in which testimony was shaped by fear, violence, and the interests of the government. Metropolitan Gelisy performed funeral prayers so that the delayed burial could proceed. Shuisky then began taking statements. The first public questioning took place before clergy and residents of Uglich. When asked how Dmitri had died, many reportedly answered that he had been murdered by Mikhail Bityagovsky and his companions on the orders of Boris Godunov. The unanimity may have reflected genuine conviction, but it also came from a city that had already killed the accused men and now faced punishment for rebellion. Shuisky then questioned Maria's brother, Mikhail Nagoy. The investigation did not focus only on Dmitri's death. It also demanded an explanation for the lynching of Bityagovsky, his son Kachalov, Volokov, Tretyakov, and others. Mikhail Nagoy insisted that Dmitri had been attacked by Osip Volokov, Danila Bityagovsky, and Nikita Kachalov. He denied ordering the crowd to kill them and claimed that the population had acted spontaneously. The investigators then moved away from large public gatherings and began questioning witnesses individually. The tone became more threatening. Officials summoned people whose testimony they believed could be shaped into a consistent account. Those questioned understood that the government was not merely determining how a child had died. It was deciding who would be punished for the destruction of royal officials. Fear altered the testimony. One witness, Rusin Rakov, claimed that Mikhail Nagoy had ordered a chicken slaughtered so that its blood could be smeared upon knives. These weapons were then supposedly placed beside the bodies of the dead officials to create false evidence of murder. They further accused Mikhail Nagoy of directing the killing of Bityagovsky's party. Their testimony may have been motivated by self-preservation. The entire Nagoy family understood that open insistence upon Boris's guilt could bring imprisonment, exile, or execution. Household servants also supported the accidental death explanation. The cook, Irina, and the chambermaid Maria Samoylova described Dmitri as suffering a seizure while playing with a knife. Vasilisa Volokova, despite having been accused by Maria immediately after the death, gave a similar account, and she testified that the prince's mother had attacked her in grief and had named the supposed murderers without evidence. Another kitchen servant, Semyon Yudin, offered testimony consistent with the official version. The statements did not agree in every detail. The time, location, witnesses, and sequence of events varied. Yet the commission treated them as supporting the same central conclusion. Dmitri had not been deliberately murdered. The Nagoys, motivated by hostility toward Bityagovsky and the Moscow government, had then accused innocent men and encouraged the mob to kill them. Shuisky recorded the testimony accepted by the commission. Together with Kleshnin and Viluzgin, he prepared the report that would be delivered to the Tsar and the Boyar Duma. The document reconstructed the prince's final days. It stated that Dmitri had suffered a seizure several days before his death. His condition improved, and he was later able to attend church and play outside. On the fatal day, he supposedly entered the courtyard with his nurse, female attendants, and several local boys. While playing a game that involved a knife, he experienced another seizure. The report claimed that his body convulsed, causing the blade to enter his throat. He fell to the ground, continued struggling, and died from the injury. To reinforce this conclusion, the investigators included testimony that Dmitri had previously displayed violent behavior during seizures. He was said to have injured his mother on one occasion and bitten another child on the hand. When Maria discovered the body, the report continued, she struck the nurse and accused Volokov, Kachalov, and Danila Bityagovsky of murder, even though none of them had been present. Maria and her intoxicated brother Mikhail then incited the population to kill the accused men and the official Mikhail Bityagovsky. The supposed motive for this accusation was financial resentment. Bityagovsky had supervised the household and refused to provide the Nagoys with more money than the state had authorized. The commission further accepted the claim that Mikhail Nagoy planted blood-stained knives and an iron club beside the bodies after learning that investigators were coming from Moscow. This report was endorsed by churchmen, including the archimandrite of the Resurrection Monastery, several monks, and the confessor attached to the Nagoy household. Whether they agreed freely is impossible to know. Every witness understood the danger of opposing the conclusion desired by the central government. Mikhail Nagoy remained the principal recorded dissenter. He continued to insist that Dmitri had been killed by men acting deliberately. The official record portrayed his refusal to accept the commission's findings not as courage, but as stubbornness and slander. The investigation thus produced two incompatible histories. In one, Dmitri was a sick child whose tragic accident provoked a violent and unjust uprising. In the other, he was the last legitimate obstacle between Boris Godunov and the throne, murdered by agents whose crime was then concealed through intimidation and fabricated testimony. Prince Vasily Shuisky formally endorsed the first explanation. Years later, under entirely different political circumstances, he would support the second. That transformation would help turn Dmitri's death from a provincial tragedy into the mystery that would tear Russia apart. Prince Vasily Shuisky returned to Moscow on June 2, 1591, and formally delivered the conclusions of the Uglich investigation to Tsar Fyodor. The Tsar did not judge the matter alone. He ordered that the report be presented before Patriarch Job, senior churchman, and the assembled boyars so that both church and state could place their authority behind the official version of Dmitri's death. During the proceedings, Metropolitan Gelisy of Krutitsy rose to provide additional testimony. He claimed that before leaving Uglich, Maria Nagaya had requested a private meeting with him. According to Gelisy, the grieving mother acknowledged that injustice had been committed against Mikhail Bityagovsky and the other officials killed by the crowd. She supposedly begged the Metropolitan to plead for mercy, fearing that Fyodor would impose capital punishment upon her brothers and relatives for inciting the violence. There is no independent confirmation that this conversation occurred. In the hostile tradition, it was portrayed as another invention intended to support the government's predetermined conclusion. Gelisy also presented a written statement attributed to the local administrator of Uglich. This document repeated that Dmitri had died during an epileptic seizure and accused the intoxicated Mikhail Nagoy of ordering the massacre of innocent state servants. Once the reports had been heard, Patriarch Job and the Ecclesiastical Council composed their judgment. They declared that the prince's life had ended through divine will rather than human conspiracy. Mikhail Nagoy and his associates were held responsible for the bloodshed that followed. They were accused of acting from private hatred and of consulting men described as sorcerers or practitioners of forbidden arts. The council did not formally determine the punishment. It acknowledged that mercy and condemnation belonged to the sovereign, while the duty of the clergy was to pray for Fyodor, Irina, and the preservation of the state. Fyodor then instructed the boyars to proceed against those declared guilty. Mikhail and Andrei Nagoy were brought to Moscow in chains. The cook, Irina Zhdanova, and her husband were also arrested, together with Andrei Mokolov, the alleged sorcerer whose supposed involvement gave the case an additional atmosphere of treason and sacrilege. The prisoners were interrogated and tortured. Unable to obtain the admission they wanted, the authorities eventually sent the prisoners into distant confinement. Maria Nagaya received a different punishment. She was forcibly removed from political life and compelled to become a nun. Against her will, she was tonsured and transferred to a convent near Cherepovets, far from Moscow and even farther from any remaining center of dynastic influence. As a nun, she could no longer appear publicly as the mother of a possible Tsar or gather supporters around the memory of her son. The government also rehabilitated the officials killed during the Uglich uprising. Their bodies had initially been thrown into a common pit outside the town. They were now exhumed, carried to consecrated ground, and honored with a second funeral. Requiem services presented them not as suspected assassins, but as faithful servants murdered while carrying out the duties of the state. The transformation was politically important. Dmitri's alleged killers became victims, while those who had avenged the prince became criminals. The punishment of Uglich was severe. Large numbers of residents accused of participating in the mob were arrested. Later narratives claimed that approximately 200 men and women were executed, though the precise number is uncertain. Others were imprisoned, mutilated, or deprived of their tongues so that they could no longer repeat accusations against the government. Families believed to have supported the uprising were driven from their homes. Fear spread quickly through the city. Even residents with no connection to the violence fled when it became clear that the inquiry had turned into a purge. Many inhabitants were sent eastward into Siberian exile. Some were transported to Pelim, a remote settlement far beyond the Urals in the region of the Tavda River. Uglich had once been a prosperous Volga city with a large population, busy markets, princely residences, and numerous churches. After the executions, confiscations, and deportations, entire neighborhoods stood nearly empty. Later, accounts exaggerated the scale of its destruction, describing it as a ghost town reduced to silence by Boris's wrath. The city was not literally erased, but its political and economic life suffered deeply. Even the bell that had summoned the people on the day of Dmitri's death became a symbolic criminal. Tradition holds that it was taken down, publicly punished, and sent into exile like a rebellious subject. While the residents of Uglich were condemned, the families of Bityagovsky and his associates reportedly received rewards. Vasilisa Volokova was said to have obtained a valuable estate. Property and money were also given to the widow and daughters of Mikhail Bityagovsky. Members of the council who confirmed the official report received promotions, favors, or land. Such stories strengthened the suspicion that the government was rewarding silence and loyalty. Andrei Kleshnin was said to have refused these honors. According to the hostile narrative, the sight of Dmitri's body and the knowledge of his own involvement destroyed him psychologically. Soon after the investigation, he abandoned court life, entered a monastery, and adopted a severe ascetic existence. His health deteriorated, and he died only a few years later. Later, writers interpreted his withdrawal as a confession made without words. Yet personal guilt cannot be proven merely from his decision to become a monk. Religious retirement was common among officials who had lost influence, suffered illness, or feared political danger. The official verdict closed the case in law. It did not close it in the minds of the people. Throughout Moscow, doubts continued to circulate. Conversations fell silent when government servants approached, but the whispers returned as soon as they passed. People spoke of the dead prince, the contradictions in the testimony, and the extraordinary speed with which the government had condemned Uglich. Some accused Boris directly. Others blamed the cowardice of the nobles and the clergy who had endorsed the inquiry. Fyodor himself was pitied or mocked as a ruler too spiritually detached to recognize the truth. Boris maintained informants in markets, taverns, churchyards, and official households. Reports of public melancholy and suspicion reached him continually. The death of Dmitri had removed a dynastic rival, but it had created something potentially more dangerous: a popular belief that Boris had murdered a child to clear his way to the throne. Soon afterward, another catastrophe struck Moscow. On the eve of Pentecost in 1591, while Feodor and several members of the court were making a pilgrimage to the Trinity Monastery of St. Sergius, fire broke out near the Kolomazhny district. The city was built largely of timber, and the flames spread with terrifying speed. Arbat, Nikitskaya, Tverskaya, and Petrovskaya were consumed. Fire moved through the White City and into poorer districts, market streets, and the settlements of the Streltsy. Houses collapsed, workshops vanished, and churches burned with their icons and possessions still inside. People who attempted to save their property were trapped or suffocated in smoke. The Kremlin and much of Kitai-Gorod survived, preserving the residences of leading officials and many of the principal commercial buildings. The districts inhabited by poorer residents suffered far more heavily. Tens of thousands were left without homes. Streets disappeared beneath ash, and surviving families gathered around the remains of their property, mourning the dead and searching for anything that could still be used. When Feodor returned after Pentecost, desperate crowds gathered along the road from the Trinity Monastery. They attempted to approach him with petitions for food, money, and shelter. Boris prevented them from reaching the Tsar directly. Instead, he placed himself before the crowd and listened to their complaints. He promised assistance and assured them that the government would rebuild what had been destroyed. The relief effort was extensive. Funds were distributed to victims. Timber and labor were provided for reconstruction. Entire rows of houses and public buildings were restored. Some taxes were delayed, petitions were granted, and families received compensation according to their losses. Boris presented himself everywhere as the organizer of recovery. For people who had lost everything, his assistance was immediate and visible. The accusations surrounding Uglich did not disappear, but they were temporarily overwhelmed by gratitude. Once again, Boris demonstrated one of his greatest political abilities. He could transform disaster into loyalty by making the state appear generous, energetic, and compassionate. His enemies saw something darker. Several later chroniclers allege that the fire had been started deliberately to distract Moscow from Dmitri's death. According to these rumors, Boris or his agents chose wooden districts where destruction would be rapid, while the principal administrative and commercial quarters remained protected. No reliable evidence proves that he ordered the fire. Urban fires were frequent in 16th century Moscow, especially during dry weather and religious festivals, when candles and cooking flames were used throughout densely packed wooden neighborhoods. Yet the timing encouraged suspicion. Boris redirected the accusations toward members of the Nagoy family. Afanasy Nagoy and several relatives were arrested and questioned about possible involvement in arson. They were not executed, and no convincing conclusion was reached. The affair slowly disappeared beneath the next national crisis. That crisis came from the south. In the summer of 1591, the Crimean Khan Ghazi II Giray launched a major invasion of Russian territory. Crimean armies had raided Muscovy for generations, seizing livestock, burning settlements, and carrying thousands of captives southward. The memory of the devastating attack on Moscow in 1571 remained vivid. The new invasion therefore caused immediate panic. Preparations were late. Regiments were not sent toward the southern defensive line until spring, and early reports failed to identify the full scale of the threat. On June 26th, a scout reached Moscow with news that a large Crimean host was advancing through the region of Tula. Contemporary Russian sources gave enormous numbers, sometimes claiming that the Khan commanded 150,000 men. Like many military estimates from the period, this was almost certainly exaggerated. Nevertheless, the force was large enough to threaten the capital. Boris assumed control of the response. Orders were sent to garrisons and commanders across the southern frontier. Regiments were instructed to concentrate near Serpukhov on the Oka River and join the army commanded by Prince Fyodor Mstislavsky. The original intention was to intercept the Crimeans before they could approach Moscow. The strategic situation quickly deteriorated. Much of the Russian army remained stationed in the northwest because of the threat from Sweden and Poland-Lithuania. There was not enough time to bring those forces south before the Khan crossed the defensive line. Reports arrived that Tula had been overrun and that the Crimean cavalry was advancing northward. The field defense at Serpukhov was abandoned. Boris and the military commanders decided that the available forces would be more effective behind prepared positions near Moscow than scattered across the open countryside. Mstislavsky was ordered to withdraw. By July 1st, the principal Russian regiments had returned to the capital. Troops were positioned along the Moscow River near Kolomenskoye, while monasteries and fortified enclosures inside the city were prepared for defense. Fyodor inspected the army on July 2nd. The appearance of the Tsar among the regiments was intended to strengthen morale, though Boris and the experienced commanders directed the preparations. The Crimean forces crossed the Oka and approached the southern outskirts of Moscow. Advance units clashed with Russian detachments while the main armies prepared for battle. Later chronicles once again gave impossible totals, claiming hundreds of thousands of soldiers on each side. The actual armies were considerably smaller, but the concentration was still one of the most serious military encounters of Fyodor's reign. Boris appeared at the defensive line dressed in armor and surrounded by senior officers. Fyodor formally entrusted the army to him and returned to the security of the Kremlin. Boris spent the night inspecting positions, issuing orders, and encouraging the troops. On July 4th, the Crimean army attacked the Russian defenses. The fighting was severe but inconclusive. Russian fortifications, cannon, and concentrated infantry made a direct assault costly. The Khan's cavalry could raid open country with extraordinary speed, but it was less effective against prepared positions near a fortified capital. Russian prisoners reportedly told the Crimeans that reinforcements were approaching from Novgorod and Pskov. Ghazi Girai may have interpreted this information as evidence that an even larger army, perhaps including foreign troops, was about to arrive. Having already suffered losses and unwilling to risk encirclement, he ordered a withdrawal. Before sunrise on July 5th, the Crimean host began retreating southward. The withdrawal was immediately proclaimed as a great Russian victory. The government credited Boris with saving Moscow. Whether he had personally determined every military decision mattered less than the image created afterward. On July 10th, Ivan Nikitich Romanov arrived at the army's positions bearing rewards from the Tsar. Gold medals and honors were distributed to Boris, Mstislavsky, and other commanders. Fyodor presented Boris with lavish gifts. These reportedly included a ceremonial fur coat decorated with gold buttons, a heavy gold chain, a precious cup associated with the victory over Mamai at Kulikovo, and several towns or estates. Most important was the title Servant of the Tsar, an exceptional distinction granted to only a few men in Russian history. A magnificent banquet followed in Moscow. Boris was celebrated as the defender of the capital and the hero of the southern campaign. Critics later claimed that the entire pageant had been organized in advance by Boris himself. Yet, even political theater required an event powerful enough to sustain it, and the retreat of the Crimean army had genuinely spared Moscow from devastation. Once again, victory was followed by repression. Rumors spread that Boris had somehow encouraged or permitted the invasion so that fear of the Crimeans would distract the people from Dmitri's death and the punishment of Uglich. The accusation was highly improbable and unsupported by convincing evidence. A Crimean attack threatened Boris's own authority and could easily have destroyed the capital. Nevertheless, the rumor circulated widely enough to concern the government. Informants traced much of the gossip to the region around Alexin and Tula, through which the invaders had passed. Arrests followed. Residents were questioned, tortured, exiled, or executed for repeating accusations against Boris. Some were mutilated, and others died under interrogation. Entire communities along the troubled southern frontier were weakened by raids, military requisitions, and political punishment. In later hostile accounts, these measures were compared with the destruction imposed upon Uglich. Boris had now established two foundations for his public authority. The first was admiration. He rebuilt burned neighborhoods, rewarded soldiers, encouraged trade, and defended the frontier. The second was fear. Anyone who openly challenged the official account of Dmitri's death risked imprisonment, exile, or mutilation. Many Russians respected him for what he achieved. Others praised him because silence seemed more dangerous. Then, an announcement from the Kremlin transformed the question of succession. After approximately a decade of marriage, Tsaritsa Irina was pregnant. Across Russia, the news was received with extraordinary hope. Fyodor had no surviving heir, and the death of Dmitry had left the future of the dynasty uncertain. A son would preserve the direct line of Ivan III and end speculation about who would inherit the throne. Later, anti-Godunov writers claimed that Boris alone was troubled by the pregnancy. After everything he had allegedly done to remove Dmitry, the birth of another male heir would once again place the crown beyond his reach. Publicly, however, Boris celebrated the news. He congratulated his sister and joined the court in prayers for a safe birth. On May 29, 1592, Irina gave birth. The child was a girl. She was named Feodosia Fyodorovna and baptized on June 14th at the Chudov monastery within the Kremlin. Moscow celebrated with almost the same enthusiasm that would have greeted a male successor. Fyodor ordered acts of mercy throughout the realm. Prisoners were released. Some death sentences were reduced. Confiscated property was restored. Donations were sent to monasteries, churches, and charitable institutions. The birth of Feodosia became a national festival of pardon and generosity. Yet the child did not solve the succession crisis. Muscovite political tradition strongly favored male rulers, and no established procedure existed for a young girl inheriting the throne in her own right. Rumors quickly appeared. Some claimed that Irina had actually delivered a son and that Boris had secretly replaced him with the daughter of a poor woman. The story contradicted the argument that Boris feared a new heir, but rumor rarely required consistency. Others argued that Feodosia should be recognized as the future ruler despite her sex. Through her, the old dynasty might survive, even if practical authority eventually passed to her husband. Court officials began exploring this possibility while she was still an infant. By the time Feodosia was approximately 1 year old, private discussions were underway about arranging a foreign marriage that could preserve the ruling line. The official Andrei Shchelkalov reportedly approached an Austrian representative with an extraordinary proposal. The Habsburg court would send a young prince, perhaps between 14 and 18 years of age, to Moscow. He would learn Russian, adopt the customs of the country, and accept the Orthodox faith. In time, he would marry Feodosia. Through this union, the daughter of Fyodor could become Tsaritsa, while her foreign husband would ascend the Russian throne beside her. The plan revealed the depth of Moscow's anxiety. The government was prepared to reshape ancient traditions, import a foreign prince, and educate him as a Russian ruler rather than allow the dynasty to disappear. For the moment, however, such plans remained speculative. Feodosia was still an infant. Fyodor remained alive. Boris continued to rule without the crown, and the future of Russia now depended upon the fragile life of a single child. The birth of Feodosia offered Boris Godunov a measure of security, though not the future he truly desired. If Fyodor died while his daughter remained alive, Boris could plausibly continue governing as regent. The men who owed their offices to the existing court would depend upon him, and a young Tsaritsa would require an experienced guardian capable of directing the state in her name. In practical terms, his power might continue almost unchanged. Yet regency was not sovereignty. Boris had already ruled Russia for years without wearing the crown. The possibility of exercising authority through his niece could protect him from political destruction, but it would not satisfy the ambition that had gradually come to dominate his life. Feodosia herself was physically fragile. From infancy, she suffered from poor health and failed to develop with the strength expected of a royal child. She died before reaching her second birthday. The little princess was buried with the solemnity due to the daughter of the Tsar. Her death brought genuine grief to Fyodor and Irina, who had waited many years for a child only to lose her after a brief life. Across Russia, churches held services for the dead princess, and the population mourned with the royal family. Boris also appeared publicly in sorrow. His enemies, however, interpreted even his grief through suspicion. Some later accused him of benefiting from the child's death and therefore imagined that he might somehow have contributed to it. There is no convincing evidence that Feodosia died through anything other than illness. The accusation formed part of the broader hostile tradition that connected Boris to the disappearance of every person who stood between him and the throne. With Feodosia gone, Another possible dynastic arrangement was considered. Boris had a daughter of his own, Ksenia Borisovna, who was approaching marriageable age. One proposal suggested that Fyodor and Irina might formally adopt her into the royal household. Such an adoption would allow Boris to remain close to the succession while presenting Ksenia as a continuation of the reigning family. Diplomatic conversations reportedly explored a marriage between Ksenia and Maximilian of Bavaria, a young prince from one of Europe's leading Catholic dynasties. The arrangement would have raised the international standing of the Godunov family and perhaps provided Russia with a foreign prince who could be drawn into the Orthodox and Muscovite political world. The project never advanced beyond preliminary discussions. It nevertheless revealed how seriously Boris and his officials examined every available path toward preserving his authority after Fyodor's death. By the middle of the 1590s, Boris's position within government had become extraordinary. Official decrees were issued in the names of Tsar Fyodor, Tsaritsa Irina, and Boris Fyodorovich Godunov. No minister or royal relative had been publicly associated with sovereign authority in quite this manner before. The wording reflected political reality. Fyodor remained the consecrated ruler. Irina represented the royal household and the hope of dynastic continuation. Boris directed the government. His official titles grew increasingly elaborate. He was described as the Tsar's brother-in-law, ruler, servant of the sovereign, master of the cavalry, commander of the palace, and governor connected with the great kingdoms of Kazan and Astrakhan. The titles were not merely ceremonial. They announced that Boris stood immediately below the monarch and far above ordinary boyars. As Fyodor's health declined, Boris became more confident. The hereditary princes who had once frightened or obstructed him no longer possessed the strength to challenge his authority openly. Some were reconciled with the government, others remained under surveillance, and several received promotions intended to secure their cooperation. Members of the Shuisky family were gradually restored to public service. Alexander and Ivan Shuisky received boyar rank, while other princely figures such as Ivan Golitsyn, Andrei Kuryakin, and Boris Cherkassky were elevated during the same period. Prince Ivan Vorotinsky, connected by marriage to Vasily Shuisky, returned to service and was appointed to an important military command in Kazan. These appointments displayed both confidence and calculation. Boris no longer needed to destroy every rival. He could afford to reward them, bind them to the administration, and make their fortunes dependent upon his favor. His popularity among ordinary Russians was cultivated with equal care. Large amounts of land confiscated during Ivan IV's terror had already been restored to previous owners during the early years of Fyodor's reign. Other estates remained under the control of the crown. Boris divided portions of this land and distributed them among serving men, settlers, and peasants. Such grants strengthened frontier communities, rewarded loyalty, and allowed him to appear as a protector of those who had suffered under the previous reign. When Boris traveled through provincial districts, his visits were accompanied by public meals, gifts, alms, and the granting of petitions. To impoverished communities, his generosity was not abstract. It appeared in food, land, money, tax relief, and direct assistance. These policies helped stabilize Russia after decades of war and internal repression. They also created a personal bond between Boris and large sections of the population. His critics saw deliberate manipulation. Churchmen and writers hostile to Godunov accused him of purchasing affection with public charity. Among those later associated with this criticism was Avrami Palitsin, who portrayed Boris's generosity as an instrument of ambition rather than an expression of compassion. Men who openly challenged the government did not usually remain free for long. Critics could be transferred, confined, forced into monasteries, or removed from influence. Foreign observers often produced a more balanced portrait. Peter Petraeus, a Swedish writer familiar with Russian affairs, described Boris as intelligent, perceptive, and capable, but also as exceptionally cunning and deceptive. This combination defined much of his reputation. Even opponents acknowledged his administrative talent. Their fear arose from the belief that every act of generosity, diplomacy, or reform concealed a deeper political purpose. By the final years of Fyodor's reign, the controversy surrounding Dmitri's death had begun to fade from immediate public attention. Several years had passed, and new concerns occupied the country. Peace, trade, settlement, military success, and reconstruction had created an atmosphere far removed from the terror of Ivan IV. Yet one of Boris's most important policies would eventually undermine much of the goodwill he had gained. This was the restriction of peasant movement associated with St. George's Day. Under the Law Code of 1497, peasants living on noble estates retained a narrow opportunity to change masters. During a limited period around the Feast of St. George in late November, they could leave one landowner and move to another after paying a departure fee and settling their obligations. The right was restricted and difficult to exercise. A peasant who departed often had to surrender property, crops, and improvements made upon the land. Even so, the law preserved the principle that rural laborers were not permanently attached to a single estate. By the late 16th century, this mobility had become a serious problem for landowners. War, famine, population movement, and the growth of new frontier settlements had created labor shortages in the central provinces. Wealthy nobles could attract peasants from smaller estates by offering better conditions, leaving poorer serving landowners without enough workers to cultivate their lands. Because the military system depended upon the income of these landholding servicemen, the movement of peasants became a state concern as well as a private dispute. Temporary restrictions had already been introduced during earlier years. In 1597, the government took a decisive step toward binding peasants more firmly to the estates on which they lived. The measure was issued in Fyodor's name, but Boris almost certainly directed the policy. It strengthened the position of landowners and allowed them to pursue peasants who had fled within a specified period. Over time, such restrictions contributed to the development of full Russian serfdom. For Boris, the policy offered political benefits. It pleased the nobility and serving landowners, whose support would become essential during the succession crisis. It also served his personal interests. By this stage, the Godunov family controlled enormous estates and depended upon a stable agricultural labor force. The law therefore protected both the state's military structure and the wealth of the man who governed it. Its long-term consequences were severe. Peasants who had once possessed at least a limited legal right to leave now found themselves increasingly trapped. Resentment accumulated quietly across the countryside. When Russia later descended into famine, rebellion, and dynastic war, many rural communities would remember that the restrictions had hardened under Boris. The ruler who had once gained support through charity and land distribution had also helped construct the legal machinery that bound millions more tightly to the soil. Meanwhile, Tsar Fyodor's health continued to deteriorate. For months, the court understood that his death was approaching. Boris made preparations for the funeral, the security of Moscow, and the transfer of authority. In the early hours of January 7th, 1598, Fyodor Ivanovich died at approximately 40 years of age. With him ended the direct male line descended from Ivan Kalita that had ruled Moscow for generations. Ivan IV had fathered several children, but most had died young. Ivan Ivanovich had died after the violent confrontation with his father. Dmitry had died at Oglich. Fyodor left no surviving child. Other branches of the ruling family had also been destroyed. Ivan IV had eliminated his cousin Vladimir of Staritsa, one of the last adult male descendants capable of presenting a dynastic challenge. Vladimir, members of his household, and even his young daughter had been killed during the terror of the previous reign. A surviving female relative, Marfa, had lived for a time outside Russia with her husband. After returning as a widow, she was forced into monastic life, removing another possible focus for dynastic opposition. By 1598, the ancient succession had reached its end. Fyodor died without leaving a clear written testament. This absence reflected both his personality and the extraordinary difficulty of the situation. No legitimate son existed, and naming a successor would have required him to choose among powerful families whose rivalry could tear the state apart. Patriarch Job and nobles gathered at his bedside reportedly asked to whom he entrusted the orphaned realm. Fyodor answered quietly that the kingdom and its people should remain in the hands of God. Whatever God had already determined would come to pass. He added words concerning Irina's future, though their meaning was uncertain. Some understood him to say that his wife should follow the customary path of a widowed tsaritsa and enter religious life. Others interpreted the statement as permission for her to inherit authority. Patriarch Job adopted the latter interpretation. Immediately after Fyodor's death, senior clergy, palace officials, and boyars swore loyalty to Irina as sovereign. For a brief moment, Russia possessed a woman recognized as the successor to the throne. Irina refused to accept the role. She declared that she wished to abandon the world, become a nun, and spend the remainder of her life in prayer. Patriarch Job and leading nobles pleaded with her to remain as ruler, but she would not change her decision. Instead, she stated that Boris should continue governing as he had during her husband's lifetime. Other traditions claimed that Job attempted to persuade Fyodor, while he was dying, to name Boris directly. According to these accounts, Fyodor refused, and may instead have mentioned his cousin Fyodor Nikitich Romanov. The evidence is uncertain, and later, political struggles shaped every surviving version of the deathbed scene. What mattered was that no uncontested successor had been named. Fyodor was buried the following day in the Cathedral of the Archangel within the Kremlin. His tomb was placed near that of Ivan IV. The funeral represented more than the burial of a ruler. It marked the conclusion of a dynasty that had built Moscow, overthrown Mongol domination, conquered Kazan and Astrakhan, and transformed a regional principality into a vast empire. Later that day, Irina left the Kremlin. She traveled to the Novodevichy convent, where she was tonsured as a nun and took the name Alexandra. Before her departure, supporters of the Godunov family reportedly contacted lower-ranking officials, military men, and members of the Moscow population. They promised rewards and encouraged public demonstrations calling for Boris to become Tsar. Whether Irina personally organized these efforts or merely permitted them is unclear. The political operation almost certainly came from Boris's circle. From the convent, Irina issued a universal amnesty. Prisoners across Russia were to be released, punishments reduced, and jails opened. The decree bore her authority, but its timing strongly suggested careful preparation by Boris. The act of mercy associated the end of the old dynasty with the generosity of the Godunov family. It also created gratitude among thousands of prisoners, relatives, officials, and provincial communities. On January 9th, senior clergy, court officials, and the Boyar Duma assembled in the Kremlin to determine how the country should be governed. Vasily Shchekalov warned that Russia faced anarchy. He suggested that the assembled boyars swear loyalty to the Duma as a collective governing institution until a permanent solution could be found. The proposal was rejected. Those present argued that they had already sworn allegiance to Irina. Even though she had entered a convent, they continued to describe her as the legitimate sovereign. This position could not be sustained for long. A cloistered nun who refused political authority could not effectively govern an expanding empire. After further debate, voices within the assembly began demanding that her brother take power. Boris had ruled beside Irina and Fyodor for years. To many officials, selecting him seemed less dangerous than allowing competing princely families to divide the state. The assembly declared that Boris should succeed his sister and become sovereign. The clergy and nobles then left the Kremlin and crossed the Moscow River toward the Novodevichy convent. There, Patriarch Job addressed Irina in the name of the church, the fatherland, and the people. He asked her to bless Boris as ruler and recognize his accession as the will of God. Job turned to Boris and offered him the crown. Boris refused. His rejection was not necessarily insincere, but it was politically useful. He did not yet possess the clear support of every hereditary prince. Accepting too quickly could make him appear to have prepared Fyodor's death and seized the throne before the country had freely chosen him. A public refusal allowed Boris to present himself not as an ambitious usurper, but as a reluctant servant being compelled by national necessity. Job and the boyars therefore agreed to postpone the decision. A larger assembly would gather after the traditional 40-day period of mourning for Fyodor. Church leaders, provincial nobles, military officers, and representatives from across Russia would have time to travel to Moscow. Boris wanted his selection to appear national rather than merely the decision of the capital. Irina remained within the convent. Her withdrawal may have been entirely voluntary. She had lost her husband and child, suffered from declining health, and had lived for years at the center of exhausting political conflict. She was also reportedly afflicted with tuberculosis. Her life had been shaped by the ambitions of others. Orphaned young and raised within the household of influential relatives, she had been selected as a wife for Fyodor because she was considered loyal, gentle, and suitable for the vulnerable heir. From this beginning, she had risen to become Tsaritsa and one of the most influential women in Russian history. For 13 years, she stood beside Fyodor and immediately behind Boris. Foreign envoys addressed her, petitions passed through her household, and royal charity was issued in her name. Her political influence had been immense, but it was always exercised within the framework created by her husband and brother. After becoming the nun Alexandra, she almost completely disappeared from public life. She remained at Novodevichy, attended worship, and avoided court ceremonies even after Boris became Tsar. She died there in October 1603, probably from tuberculosis after several years of voluntary seclusion. While Irina withdrew from the world, Boris temporarily joined her at the convent. On January 17th, he left the center of government and took up residence at Novodevichy. The Boyar Duma continued ruling in Irina's name while the question of succession remained unresolved. The move was carefully judged. By withdrawing from the Kremlin, Boris avoided appearing to control the assembly, selecting the next ruler. At the same time, anyone seeking access to Irina, the symbolic source of legitimate authority, had to approach the convent where Boris was present. His path to the throne depended upon several forces. He needed the blessing of his sister. He required Patriarch Job to provide religious legitimacy. He had to win the acceptance of the Boyar Duma and neutralize the hereditary princes. Most importantly, he wanted the appearance of popular support. Boris believed that years of peace, charity, military success, and administrative reform had prepared the country to accept him. He was largely correct. The ancient princely families disliked and feared him, but they were divided. The Shwitskys, Vorotinskys, Rostovskys, and other descendants of the older Suzdal line possessed claims based upon ancestry. Yet none enjoyed Boris's national reputation or controlled the machinery of government. They resented the prospect of a Godunov dynasty. They spoke contemptuously of his supposedly Tatar origin, his connection to the Oprichnina, and his lack of ancient royal blood. Yet they could not agree upon a single candidate from among themselves. Lithuanian-descended princely families such as the Mstislavskys, Golitsins, and Trubetskoys also regarded Boris as an upstart. They feared that his accession would permanently place them beneath a house they considered socially inferior. Their opposition, however, was weakened by rivalry over whose hereditary claim should take priority. Many boyars therefore looked toward Fyodor Nikitich Romanov. Fyodor Romanov was the son of Nikita Romanovich Yuryev, the respected uncle and advisor of Tsar Fyodor. Through the first wife of Ivan IV, the Romanovs were closely connected to the former ruling house. Fyodor Nikitich was middle-aged, handsome, confident, and popular. He possessed charm, aristocratic dignity, and the reputation of a generous nobleman. Rumors that the dying Tsar had named him as successor strengthened his position. Yet the Romanovs had limitations. Their family had risen recently compared with the ancient princely houses, and Fyodor Nikitich had never governed Russia on the scale that Boris had. The old princes were unwilling to surrender their own claims merely to prevent Boris from winning. They distrusted the Romanovs almost as much as they distrusted the Godunovs. The aristocracy also resisted Patriarch Job's attempt to direct the succession. Many boyars believed the choice of a ruler belonged to the Duma and the political estates of the realm, not to the clergy. The division among Boris's opponents became his greatest advantage. On February 17, 1598, a vast national assembly gathered in the Kremlin. More than 500 churchmen, boyars, nobles, military commanders, court officials, and provincial representatives were said to have attended. It was one of the largest political gatherings yet held in Muscovite Russia. Its purpose was to select a sovereign. Patriarch Job opened the proceedings. He described Russia as an orphaned land grieving without a ruler. The state, he said, awaited the wisdom of the assembled clergy, nobles, officials, and representatives of the people. Job then announced his own conclusion. No person other than Boris Fyodorovich Godunov possessed the experience, ability, and divine favor necessary to govern the realm. The response recorded by official accounts was immediate. The assembly declared that it shared the patriarch's judgment and wished to petition Boris without seeking any other candidate. The hall filled with cries of his name. Such unanimity may have been exaggerated in accounts sponsored by the new government. Opposition almost certainly existed, though few men were willing to express it openly in an assembly dominated by Boris's supporters. Speakers rose to construct a history in which his accession appeared not merely desirable, but inevitable. One nobleman recalled that Boris and Irina had grown up within the household of Ivan IV. They had eaten at the royal table, learned the customs of government, and become members of the Tsar's family. Ivan was said to have regarded Boris not as a servant, but as a son. According to this ceremonial account, the old Tsar had once raised his hand and named Fyodor, Irina, and Boris together as the three people upon whom the future of the realm depended. On his deathbed, Ivan supposedly entrusted his son, daughter-in-law, and government to Boris and warned him that he would answer before God if he failed to protect them. The authenticity of such statements cannot be established. Their purpose was clear. They gave Boris the blessing of the dead, Ivan IV, and transformed his long control of government into the fulfillment of a royal command. Other speakers praised his achievements. They credited him with restoring Russia after the Oprichnina, defeating Sweden, driving back the Crimean Khan, restraining Poland-Lithuania, expanding settlement across Siberia, and increasing Moscow's standing among European rulers. They praised his reconstruction of the army, his reforms of provincial administration, his attempts to reduce corruption, and his support for the poor. Patriarch Job added that Fyodor himself had intended Boris to succeed him and that divine providence had guided the Godunov family toward the throne. Once again, the hall echoed with acclamations. Job declared that the voice of the people expressed the voice of God. The political message was carefully constructed. Boris was not claiming power through conquest. The church called him, the nobles selected him, the people demanded him. The old rulers had prepared him. God himself appeared to approve, yet Boris still refused. Beginning before sunrise on February 18th, crowds gathered in the Cathedral of the Assumption and prayed that his heart would be softened. Similar services continued over the following days. On February 20th, Patriarch Job and leading nobles went to the convent and informed Boris that he had been chosen not merely by Moscow, but by all Russia. Boris again declined. His resistance became part of the ceremony of accession. Each refusal made his eventual acceptance appear less like ambition and more like sacrifice. On February 21st, prayers were held throughout Moscow. Congregations asked God to persuade Boris to assume the burden of sovereignty. The services continued through the night. Patriarch Job then prepared a vast religious procession. At sunrise on February 22nd, church bells sounded across the entire city. The doors of churches and homes opened as clergy and inhabitants moved toward the Kremlin and Red Square. Job carried the revered icon of the Virgin of Vladimir. Another churchman bore the icon of the Virgin of the Don. These were not ordinary religious images. They were symbols of divine protection during the greatest dangers in Russian history. Behind them came bishops, monks, choirs, boyars, officials, soldiers, merchants, women, children, beggars, and crowds from every district of Moscow. The procession left the city and moved toward the Novodevichy convent. There, the icon of the Virgin of Smolensk was brought out to meet them. Boris emerged from the convent and approached the gathering. When he saw Patriarch Job carrying the sacred image, he fell to his knees. Official descriptions portrayed him bursting into tears and crying out to the Mother of God, asking why such a burden had been placed upon him and begging for protection beneath her mercy. Job answered that Boris should not surrender to fear or sorrow. The patriarch told him that the procession itself revealed divine providence. The Mother of God, he declared, had shown her favor toward him. Boris must humble himself before that will. The The crown was no longer being offered merely by ambitious courtiers. It had been placed before him as a sacred command from Russia, the Church, and heaven itself. When Tsar Fyodor I died without leaving a male heir, Russia entered one of the most uncertain moments in its history. The Rurik dynasty, which had ruled for centuries, had reached its end, and the question of succession threatened to divide both the court and the nation. Among the many powerful figures surrounding the throne, none possessed greater influence than Boris Godunov. For years, he had directed much of the government's daily affairs, quietly building alliances within the military, the bureaucracy, and the Orthodox Church. Now, with the throne vacant, that influence would be tested as never before. Although many nobles believed the Boyar Duma should determine Russia's future, a different movement quickly gathered strength. Patriarch Job, convinced that only Boris could preserve stability, openly supported his elevation to the throne. Delegations of clergy, nobles, soldiers, and ordinary citizens traveled to the convent where Boris had withdrawn with his sister Irina. The visits were carefully staged as humble requests rather than political negotiations. Boris repeatedly hesitated, insisting that he sought neither power nor a crown. Whether these refusals reflected genuine reluctance or calculated political theater remains one of the enduring questions surrounding his rise. As the ceremonies continued, Moscow itself became part of the spectacle. Crowds gathered in the streets, church bells rang across the city, and prayers were offered for the kingdom's future. Supporters portrayed Boris as the only man capable of preventing civil unrest, while critics whispered darker stories. Rumors spread that he had been responsible for the deaths of rivals who stood between him and supreme power. No convincing proof emerged, yet the accusations followed him throughout his reign, casting a permanent shadow over every public celebration. Eventually, Boris accepted what was presented as the will of God and the desire of the Russian people. His return to Moscow resembled a triumphal procession. Citizens greeted him with bread and salt, symbols of welcome and loyalty, while gifts of gold, silver, jewels, and expensive furs were offered along his route. Boris refused nearly all of them, explaining that the wealth of the state was sufficient and that his subjects should keep their possessions. The gesture reinforced the image of a ruler who valued service above personal enrichment, strengthening his popularity at the very moment he needed it most. Before his formal coronation could take place, alarming reports arrived from the southern frontier. Scouts and prisoners claimed that the Crimean Khan was assembling a major invasion force with Ottoman support. Boris reacted immediately. Orders spread across the realm, noble commanders gathered their retainers, and thousands of soldiers marched toward defensive positions along the Oka River. Vast camps appeared across the countryside, displaying a military strength intended not only to repel an invasion, but also to demonstrate that the new ruler could protect Russia from its enemies. Weeks passed with little sign of the feared attack. Doubts began to circulate among officers and courtiers. Some wondered whether the threat had been exaggerated to unite the country behind its new sovereign. Yet before those suspicions could grow into open criticism, envoys from the Crimean Khan arrived seeking peace instead of war. Astonished by the scale of the Russian mobilization, they renewed diplomatic relations rather than risk a costly conflict. Without fighting a decisive battle, Boris returned to Moscow as the leader who had apparently secured peace through overwhelming preparedness rather than bloodshed. His coronation later that year became one of the grandest ceremonies Russia had witnessed. Surrounded by church leaders, nobles, foreign guests, and cheering crowds, Boris received the symbols of royal authority and promised that his reign would bring justice and compassion. He declared that no orphan or destitute person would be abandoned while he occupied the throne, presenting himself as a ruler whose duty extended beyond warfare and politics to the welfare of every subject. The promises were followed by generous acts. Prisoners received pardons or reduced sentences. Government officials were rewarded, merchants enjoyed commercial privileges, and tax relief was granted in several regions. Charitable gifts flowed from the treasury, while loyal servants found themselves promoted to influential positions. These measures won Boris widespread approval during the opening months of his reign and helped establish the image of a capable administrator determined to restore order after years of uncertainty. Yet admiration was never universal. To supporters, Boris Godunov was an energetic reformer whose intelligence and discipline rescued Russia from a dangerous succession crisis. He strengthened the administration, improved state finances, enforced law and order, and acted decisively whenever the kingdom faced external threats. Many believed few rulers possessed his ability to govern such a vast realm efficiently. His opponents reached the opposite conclusion. They argued that beneath his careful displays of humility stood an ambitious politician willing to manipulate public opinion, religious authority, and state institutions to secure absolute power. The persistent allegations surrounding the death of Tsarevich Dmitry continued to haunt his reputation, ensuring that every achievement would be viewed through the lens of suspicion. History has therefore remembered Boris Godunov as one of Russia's most complicated rulers. He combined genuine administrative talent with relentless political ambition, earning both admiration and distrust in equal measure. His rise to the throne demonstrated remarkable skill. His government initially brought stability, yet the controversies that surrounded his path to power never disappeared. Long after the celebrations faded and the crown rested securely upon his head, Russia remained divided over whether Boris had been the kingdom's greatest savior or merely its most successful political survivor. As Boris Godunov settled into power, Russia entered a period that initially appeared to confirm the hopes of his supporters. The government strengthened its hold over the vast eastern frontier, encouraging settlers to move into Siberia by granting land and founding new fortified towns. These settlements became both military outposts and centers of trade, extending Moscow's influence ever deeper into Asia. At the same time, Russia enjoyed an unusual period of relative peace. Border clashes still occurred, particularly with the Crimean Khanate, but no major war threatened the stability of the realm. Relations with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth also remained comparatively calm as new diplomatic agreements reduced the likelihood of open conflict. While expanding the state abroad, Boris pursued another goal much closer to home. His daughter, Ksenia, had become one of the most admired noblewomen in Russia, and the Tsar believed her marriage could strengthen his dynasty's legitimacy. Rather than choosing a Russian nobleman, he searched among Europe's royal families, hoping that an alliance with an established dynasty would elevate the international standing of the Godunov house. After one unsuccessful negotiation, attention turned toward Prince Johann of Denmark. The proposal was welcomed enthusiastically, and preparations for the young prince's arrival reflected the enormous importance attached to the marriage. As he crossed into Russian territory, he was greeted with magnificent ceremonies, valuable gifts, and lavish hospitality. Every stage of his journey toward Moscow became a public celebration designed to display both the wealth of the Russian court and the generosity of its ruler. When Johann finally reached the capital, he was received with exceptional honor. Boris welcomed him almost as a member of the family, introducing him to the royal court with elaborate banquets and expensive presents. Although the engagement had not yet been formally completed, optimism surrounded the planned union. Ksenia herself was praised by contemporaries for her education, gentle temperament, and beauty, while Johann began studying the Russian language and the Orthodox faith in preparation for his future life in Moscow. Yet the celebrations came to a sudden end. Only weeks before the wedding, the young Danish prince fell gravely ill. Physicians from across the capital attempted every available treatment, while Boris personally ordered that nothing be spared in the effort to save his future son-in-law. Clergy prayed continuously for his recovery, and the Tsar reportedly promised extraordinary acts of charity if the prince survived. Despite every attempt, Johann died before the marriage could take place. The tragedy deeply affected the Godunov family. Instead of preparing for a royal wedding, Moscow organized a funeral attended by Russian nobles and Danish representatives. Boris sought to ease the loss by providing generous gifts to the prince's companions and distributing charity throughout the capital. Even so, he refused to abandon his ambition of linking his dynasty with a European royal house, and soon opened negotiations with another Danish family, though changing political circumstances prevented those plans from advancing. During these same years, many observers described Russia as stronger than it had been in generations. The treasury was stable, the frontiers were secure, churches and monasteries continued to spread into newly settled territories, and the country's influence abroad steadily increased. Boris frequently presented himself as a ruler who preferred diplomacy over conquest and exile over execution. To much of the population, he appeared to have fulfilled the promise of restoring order after years of uncertainty. Beneath this image of stability, however, a profound transformation was taking place within the Tsar himself. As time passed, Boris gradually withdrew from public life. The ruler, who had once appeared among ordinary people, listened to petitions, and cultivated an image of accessibility, became increasingly secluded within the Kremlin. Old accusations surrounding the death of Tsarevich Dmitry never completely disappeared, and although they were rarely voiced openly, they lingered in whispers throughout the country. Whether these rumors genuinely tormented Boris, or whether growing illness fueled his fears, remains uncertain, but his confidence steadily gave way to suspicion. His health also declined. Extended periods of illness confined him to Moscow, and for a time many believed the Tsar was close to death. The uncertainty surrounding his condition encouraged powerful noble families to consider what might happen if the throne suddenly became vacant. Among those whose influence grew during this period were members of the Romanov family, who possessed both royal connections and considerable support within the aristocracy. When Boris eventually recovered, he no longer viewed political rivals with the caution of an experienced statesman. Instead, he regarded potential competitors as immediate threats to his family's survival. Determined to eliminate every possibility of opposition, he ordered investigations into prominent noble houses. Exile replaced execution as his preferred instrument, but the punishment was often no less devastating. Leading members of influential families were stripped of their estates, forced into monasteries, imprisoned in distant regions, or separated permanently from their relatives. Some were compelled to take monastic vows against their will, while others disappeared into isolated northern settlements where harsh conditions claimed many lives. Officially, these actions were presented as measures to protect the state. To many contemporaries, however, they marked the beginning of a quieter but equally relentless campaign of political repression. Fear soon spread beyond the great aristocratic houses. Informers multiplied, accusations became increasingly common, and suspicion reached every level of society. Noblemen feared their servants, officials distrusted their colleagues, and private conversations were held only in whispers. Unlike the spectacular public executions of Ivan the Terrible, Boris's methods were largely hidden from view, yet the atmosphere they created proved equally unsettling. Arrests, exile, and secret investigations replaced public terror, allowing repression to continue without the dramatic displays that had once shocked the nation. By the final years of his reign, the admiration that had greeted Boris's accession had begun to fade. Many Russians still respected his administrative ability and acknowledged the prosperity achieved during his government. Others, however, increasingly viewed him as a ruler consumed by insecurity, convinced that conspiracies surrounded him on every side. The contrast between the hopeful beginning of his reign and its increasingly oppressive character would shape the reputation he carried into history. A sovereign remembered both for strengthening the Russian state and for allowing fear to transform his rule into one marked by distrust and relentless persecution. By the opening years of the 17th century, Boris Godunov's government had become increasingly consumed by fear. Suspicion replaced trust, and the machinery of the state gradually transformed into an instrument of repression. Accusations no longer required convincing evidence. A handful of servants seeking wealth or revenge could fabricate a conspiracy against their own master, and once informers confirmed the story, the nobleman and his family were stripped of their estates and banished to distant regions. Their lands were confiscated, loyal informers received generous rewards, and anyone refusing to cooperate often faced imprisonment, torture, or death. Fear reached every corner of society. Clergymen denounced fellow priests, monks accused one another of treason, and ordinary citizens volunteered as informers in hopes of gaining favor with the crown. The result was a kingdom where silence became the safest form of survival. The Tsar's growing insecurity also shaped his political decisions. Concerned that rival dynasties might one day challenge his son for the throne, he restricted influential princely families and continued removing suspected opponents from the political center. Many exiles were sent to the frontier regions bordering Lithuania, where earlier rulers had settled criminals to strengthen the border. Ironically, these displaced nobles, soldiers, and political prisoners would later unite against the very ruler who had banished them. At the same time, another danger was developing beyond Moscow's control. Runaway peasants, escaped serfs, adventurers, and Cossack communities gathered across the southern frontier. Years of hardship, political persecution, and social inequality created a restless population with little loyalty to the government. Although divided at first, these frontier groups would eventually find common purpose under a single banner. Nature then delivered a catastrophe that transformed political dissatisfaction into national disaster. In 1601, relentless rains destroyed Russia's crops, and when the waters finally receded, an unexpected frost wiped out what little had survived. Harvests failed across central Russia, grain prices multiplied, and famine spread with terrifying speed. Boris ordered royal granaries opened, distributed money to the poor, and attempted to regulate food prices, but the scale of the crisis overwhelmed every effort. Starving families abandoned their homes and flooded into Moscow searching for relief. As food disappeared, desperation replaced morality. Theft became commonplace, violence erupted daily, disease spread through crowded streets, and reports of cannibalism shocked even hardened officials. Thousands died in the capital alone, while countless others perished unseen throughout the countryside. Although the government organized burials and escorted grain convoys from regions spared by the disaster, recovery came only after the harvest of 1603. By then, the damage extended far beyond the loss of life. Many peasants blamed wealthy landowners and monasteries for hoarding grain, while ordinary people starved. Others believed the famine represented divine punishment for the crimes associated with Boris Godunov's rise to power. Hoping to relieve growing unrest, the government granted greater freedom to peasants abandoned during the famine, yet many simply fled toward the frontier, strengthening the discontent already gathering beyond the state's reach. The years that followed left Russia morally exhausted. Corruption flourished, bribery became commonplace, and confidence in both the nobility and the clergy steadily declined. Even natural events acquired political meaning. When a brilliant comet appeared in the sky during 1604, many regarded it as a warning that even greater calamities were approaching. Among the men whose lives were shaped by this atmosphere was Yuri Otrepyev. Born into a minor noble family and educated while serving prominent aristocratic households, he possessed intelligence, ambition, and familiarity with court politics. As Boris intensified his campaign against suspected rivals, Otrepyev abandoned secular life and entered a monastery, taking the name Grigory. His decision likely saved him from sharing the fate of many political victims, yet it also marked the beginning of an extraordinary journey. Grigory wandered from monastery to monastery across Russia, gaining experience, education, and valuable contacts. His abilities attracted the attention of Patriarch Job, who assigned him important clerical duties that occasionally brought him into the Kremlin itself. There, he observed the workings of government, listened to court gossip, and learned of the growing uncertainty surrounding the mysterious death of Tsarevich Dmitry. Over time, he began making astonishing remarks, claiming that destiny had prepared him for Russia's throne. Most dismissed the comments as arrogance, but word eventually reached Boris Godunov. Already haunted by conspiracies both real and imagined, the Tsar reacted swiftly. Orders were issued for Grigory's arrest and permanent exile to a remote monastery. Before they could be carried out, however, friends warned him of the danger, allowing him to escape Moscow disguised as a wandering monk. Accompanied by a handful of companions, he traveled south through monasteries and borderlands, disappearing from the reach of the authorities. That escape would alter Russian history. Beyond the frontier, the obscure monk Grigory Otrepyev would soon abandon his old identity and present himself as the man many Russians desperately wished had survived, the lost Tsarevich Dmitry. In a kingdom weakened by famine, fear, political persecution, and growing distrust of its ruler, his remarkable claim would ignite the opening chapter of the time of troubles. The mysterious escape of Grigory Otrepyev marked the beginning of one of the greatest political deceptions in Russian history. After slipping away from Moscow before the authorities could arrest him, the wandering monk traveled through monasteries in Ukraine and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, quietly cultivating stories that the murdered Tsarevich Dmitry had, in fact, survived. At first, these rumors attracted little attention, but Otrepiev understood that a believable legend could become a weapon more powerful than an army. Eventually, he abandoned his monastic identity altogether. Trading his robes for the life of a soldier and adventurer, he joined Cossack bands operating along the frontier, where he learned horsemanship, swordsmanship, and the harsh realities of frontier warfare. Later, he continued his education in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, mastering languages, observing Western political culture, and establishing relationships that would soon prove invaluable. By the time he entered the service of Prince Adam Vishnyovyetsky, he had transformed himself from an obscure fugitive into a remarkably persuasive political actor. Realizing that an ordinary exile would never attract powerful allies, Otrepiev devised a far bolder strategy. Pretending to be gravely ill, he hinted that he carried an extraordinary secret and arranged for a dramatic confession to reach influential figures around him. When a letter was discovered claiming that he was the long-lost Tsarevich Dmitry, supposedly rescued from assassination as a child, curiosity rapidly turned into excitement. Otrepiev supported his remarkable story with carefully chosen details and symbolic objects, presenting himself not as an ambitious pretender, but as the rightful heir returning to reclaim his inheritance. For many Polish nobles, the truth mattered less than the opportunity. If the claimant truly was Ivan the Terrible's son, Poland could gain enormous influence over Russia. If he was an impostor but managed to seize the throne, the result could be equally profitable. Powerful magnates welcomed him into their households, financed his activities, and introduced him to King Sigismund III. Church leaders also recognized the enormous possibilities. A Russian ruler sympathetic to Catholic interests could fundamentally reshape the religious balance of Eastern Europe. Otrepiev proved willing to make extraordinary promises. He accepted conversion to Catholicism, pledged greater religious cooperation, and offered generous territorial and financial concessions to those willing to support his cause. His alliance with the influential Mniszek family strengthened these ambitions even further. Plans for marriage to Marina Mniszek transformed political cooperation into a dynastic partnership, while military backing gradually took shape behind closed doors. What had begun as the claim of a wandering monk was evolving into an organized campaign to seize the Russian throne. Perhaps Otrepiev's greatest strength lay not in military ability, but in absolute self-confidence. Those who met him frequently remarked on his intelligence, eloquence, and unwavering conviction. He spoke not as a man hoping to become Tsar, but as someone who believed the crown already belonged to him. Whether this confidence reflected calculated deception, genuine self-belief, or an extraordinary blend of both remains one of history's unanswered questions. His certainty persuaded many who might otherwise have dismissed his astonishing story. The evidence supporting his identity, however, was remarkably fragile. Witnesses offered contradictory accounts, physical descriptions failed to match the real Tsarevich Dmitry, and the chronology of his supposed survival shifted depending on who repeated the tale. Yet these inconsistencies rarely discouraged his supporters. Russia was entering a period of famine, political repression, and widespread dissatisfaction with Boris Godunov. Under such conditions, many people were prepared to believe in a miraculous survivor if it offered hope for change. Historians have long debated who truly orchestrated the deception. Some point toward ambitious Polish magnates seeking influence over Moscow. Others emphasize Catholic missionaries who hope to extend their religious influence into Russia. Still others argue that discontented Russian nobles quietly encouraged Otrepiev, intending to use him as a convenient instrument to remove Godunov before discarding him once their objective had been achieved. Whatever the original conspiracy may have been, the result was the same. An obscure former monk suddenly stood at the center of an international political movement. By 1604, Otrepiev was no longer simply a fugitive fleeing the Kremlin. Backed by wealthy patrons, supported by foreign interests, and increasingly accepted by those desperate for an alternative to Boris Godunov, he prepared to march toward Russia under the name of Tsarevich Dmitry. his extraordinary claim would soon plunge the country into the opening battles of the time of troubles, a conflict in which belief often proved more powerful than truth itself. By the summer of 1604, the man now calling himself Tsarevich Dmitri was no longer an isolated pretender. Around him gathered an unlikely coalition drawn from every corner of Eastern Europe. Polish volunteers, restless mercenaries, impoverished adventurers, Cossack warriors, political refugees, and Russians driven into exile by Boris Godunov's purges all found common cause under his banner. Some genuinely believed he was the surviving son of Ivan the Terrible, while others cared little about his identity. For them, the campaign offered revenge, wealth, glory, or simply the chance to overturn a government they had come to despise. As support increased, so did opposition. Not everyone accepted the extraordinary claim. Individuals who had known Grigory Otrepiev before his transformation publicly denounced him as an impostor, insisting that the supposed Tsarevich was nothing more than a former monk reinventing himself for political gain. Yet these voices carried little weight. Powerful patrons had already invested too much in the venture, and inconvenient witnesses were quickly silenced. The movement had advanced beyond questions of truth. It had become a struggle over power. Recognizing the importance of the Cossacks, Otrepiev appealed directly to their sense of injustice. For years, many of them had clashed with Boris Godunov's government and viewed Moscow with increasing hostility. His message promised not only the return of the rightful heir, but also the overthrow of a tyrant responsible for their suffering. Cossack leaders responded enthusiastically, bringing experienced horsemen into the growing army. At the same time, supporters crossed the frontier distributing letters and proclamations throughout southern Russia, announcing that the murdered Tsarevich Dmitri had miraculously survived and would soon reclaim his father's throne. The rumors spread rapidly through villages, frontier settlements, and military outposts, where resentment toward the government already ran deep. The campaign gained momentum long before a single major battle was fought. Every refugee who crossed the border, every dissatisfied peasant, and every exile seeking revenge became another potential recruit. Entire frontier communities that had endured years of hardship under Moscow's rule began preparing to welcome the advancing claimant rather than resist him. What had started as a daring deception was gradually evolving into a genuine political movement. News of these developments reached Boris Godunov almost immediately. Reports arrived from border commanders, foreign officials, and government spies, each describing the appearance of a man claiming to be the long-dead Tsarevich Dmitri. Other dispatches spoke of growing Cossack activity and rebellious groups openly declaring that they would soon march beside the rightful heir. The steady stream of alarming intelligence unsettled the Tsar. Although he maintained an appearance of confidence before the court, privately his anxiety deepened with every report. Convinced that a conspiracy stretched far beyond the frontier, Boris ordered a new investigation. Suspicions once again fell upon the boyars, former political rivals, and anyone who might have benefited from the return of a legitimate heir. Even Dmitri's own mother was summoned and questioned in an effort to uncover the truth behind the astonishing rumors. She denied any knowledge of the claimant, but Boris remained unconvinced, fearing that hidden allies inside Russia were preparing to support an invasion. Eventually, his agents uncovered the identity of the pretender. The mysterious prince was identified as Grigory Otrepiev, the former monk whose arrest Boris himself had once ordered. The revelation only intensified the Tsar's anger. Officials responsible for allowing Otrepiev to escape were accused of negligence or treason, and severe punishment followed. Rather than calming the crisis, these reprisals reinforced the atmosphere of fear already gripping the government. By the close of 1604, two dramatically different images confronted one another across Eastern Europe. In Moscow, Boris Godunov ruled an increasingly suspicious state that relied on surveillance, interrogations, and harsh reprisals to preserve order. Beyond the frontier, Grigory Otrepiev gathered soldiers, nobles, Cossacks, and dreamers beneath the banner of the surviving Tsarevich Dmitri. One possessed the throne, the treasury, and the institutions of government. The other possessed a story powerful enough to persuade thousands that history itself had taken an unexpected turn. Soon, those competing visions would collide, drawing Russia ever deeper into the chaos remembered as the time of troubles.